Breaking a spear shaft with a shield, would that work? Probably not. You can cut through a spear shaft, but it takes several blows with a sharp sword. It's not a lightsaber. Hi, I'm Matt Easton.
Hi, I'm Toby Capwell.
私は赤上仁と申します。
My name is Jim Kent.
Hi, my name is Thekla Hutyrova.
Hi, I'm Shane Adams, the owner of the Knights of Valor.
My name's Dave Rawlings of the London Longsword Academy.
My name is Jamie Yankovitz.
So today we're going to be looking at some polearm combat scenes.
Horseback fights in
Medieval arms and armor.
Nunchuck scenes.
忍者の姿を見て
We're going to be looking at some archery scenes from TV and film and seeing how kind of realistic they are. It's got what we call a cant on the bow there. I tend to shoot with a little bit of a cant. It opens up the sight window as well. If your bow's up straight like that, generally the thing you're trying to shoot is going to be hidden by the bow. So I tend to drop the bow out of the way a little bit, which is what he's doing. He's clearly pointing one way, but you can see the arrow on his hand pointing the other way. And a lot of people call that the archer's paradox. The archer's paradox is the fact that the arrow's pointing off to the left when you're actually pointing at the target at the right. That's the paradox, and it's the flexing of the arrow that makes it travel down range. Could I kill this dude running away? Depends on the distance. I'm only really accurate up to probably about 30 meters. I'd get him eventually. See, I'd be zigging and zagging. I'd be serpentining. There is a type of archery called a clout, typically done by English longbow archers, which is long distance shooting, where you shoot at a flag in the ground, sort of 180, 200 yards away, shooting up, shooting down, closest to the flag. So there are people that can shoot very, very well at long range. Medieval longbow archers were, could be pretty accurate. The bow looked like it had what they call pony limbs, where you've got the basic bow, and then you'd have another set of limbs that come off the front. So that limb is attached to that limb, and that limb is attached to that limb, and that gives you way more power. So it would be perfect for that kind of, killing dudes running away kind of archery. I'm going to give it a 9 for Game of Thrones, I think. Compound bow is typically sort of either a target style or a hunting bow. You can adjust the angle that the limbs are at, and if you wind them in, it gives you a little bit more power. And I think what he's doing there is maximizing his power on his compound bow. Now, you can buy arrows that come in parts. That's not how arrows work. That's just asking for trouble. There are points in an arrow that flex, and if you are cutting an arrow into 3 and assembling it, it's not going to behave like it should. Now, that's John Rambo's grenade-tipped arrow. There was a type of broadhead you could buy, and it came in a case like that. I think that's just the case of a broadhead sprayed bronze. Shooting left-handed, so that's okay. But I know later on he shoots it right-handed. The arrow flight on that is utter garbage. I mean, he's shooting okay. He's shooting a compound off his fingers, which is fine. Compounds tend to use a release aid, which gives you a much straighter release. Well, I mean, this type of bow, the further you pull it back, the higher the poundage gets. A compound bow starts high and gets lighter. So you can hold it at full draw for long periods of time, a little bit more sort of fast, a bit more powerful. Grenade-tipped arrow, yeah, they do exist. Whether or not they're commercially available, I don't know. Everything else looked really good. The way he was setting up the bow, the way he was changing his poundage and everything, I like that. And the fact that he shot the arrow, it flew like garbage, but if you got a grenade sitting on the end of the arrow, it probably would fly like that. So weirdly, I think it's probably quite realistic. I'm going to give Rambo an 8. There's a huge tennis ball on the end of an arrow. The more weight you put on the front of an arrow, the less efficient it's going to be. It's just not going to go very far.
Let me just fix this. Give me a second.
Is a little grabber or something on the end of that arrow. Again, that's going to add even more weight. It's not a case of one arrow fits all. Arrows come in spine weights, and that refers to the stiffness of the arrow. And obviously certain bows need a certain spine weight. So the higher the poundage the bow, the stiffer the arrow needs to be, and vice versa. So by adding a lot of weight to the front of the arrow, you dynamically weaken the spine of the arrow. So therefore the arrow would be out spine, and it would probably just veer off to the right and not hit the bell at all. You can shoot something called a blunt, which is a flat arrowhead, which would be for either stump shooting, shooting tin cans, you know, that kind of thing, or small game hunting. She's moving her arm up. And when you're shooting at distance, whether it's low down or high up, you don't really move your arm, you move from the waist, so you kind of pivot your whole body, not just your arm up and down. That's something I just spotted. The shot itself, not very realistic at all, but her shooting is pretty good. We'll go 5. 5 out of 10 in the middle.
Ready your bows! Fire!
You've got really long arrows there. It looks like she's only using 2 fingers on the string, one above, one below. I've seen people do that. So she's got quite an overdraw there. She's got this explosive release, which, again, in order to make a good archery shot, you need to keep it concise and simple, because something like that, you're not going to be able to repeat it time and time again. If you've got a simple release that comes back, you can repeat that. You've got to be safe with everything you film. And I imagine that bow was probably a very real bow, but it was probably such low poundage and had such a stretchy string that it goes straight back to being a straight piece of wood. The distance between the lowest point of the bow and the string, that's called the brace height. If your brace height is too low, your bow becomes very noisy. It becomes quite quick, but it becomes very noisy, and you're really, really in danger of getting some real nasty string burn on your arm. Shooting multiple arrows off a bow at the same time, what happens is, because you've got all the energy comes from the limbs and pulling the string back, and what that does, it pushes the arrow forward. And the heavier the arrow that it needs to push, the more energy it needs to sort of get that arrow to where it needs to go. But if you're shooting multiple arrows, essentially the bow doesn't know there's multiple arrows on there, it just thinks there's a really heavy arrow. 2 arrows is double the weight, you know, and the more arrows you put on, the heavier weight that bow is going to need to push the arrows through the air, and it basically just takes all the guts out of the bow. We'll give Wonder Woman a 5. They did all right.
Curse this dress!
In order to shoot well, you need to be able to move. So I think the fact that they've got her in a tight thing and she can't shoot properly, I think it's brilliant. Archery is all about keeping everything straight. The less influence you can have over the bow, the better the arrow is going to fly. So if you're influencing the shot's not going to go right. So if you can keep everything nice and simple, which she's doing, she's coming back on the same plane as the arrow's going forward. Archery is all about being able to repeat the shot time and time again. There's a famous book called The Art of Repetition, which is all about archery. And if you can replicate your shot time and time again, you will be a fantastic archer. She seems to have a nice repeatable kind of form there. Now look at this loose. The trick is with archery, is you don't let go of the string. The trick is to try and no longer be holding the string. So you've got to relax your hand, let the hand flow back. If you're kind of trying to open your hand as hard as you can, you'll never beat the string. The string is going to be quicker than your reactions across the board. So if you can just get to your anchor point and then relax your hand and let it come back, you're going to get a much smoother release. And you can see your hand just relaxes. A lot of people think arrows fly straight. They don't. If you watch an arrow in slow motion, it's like a wet noodle going down range. Which is Robin Hooded an arrow, which is where you shoot an arrow down the back of another arrow, and the grain tends to split, but the grain never runs perfectly parallel down the back of an arrow. It will always kind of peel off. It's actually really hard to do with wooden arrows. It's a lot easier to do with sort of modern arrows because they're a tube of carbon, and it's easier to kind of put an arrow down the back of another one. That's 10. One of the best representations of the way an arrow and a bow work together.
Stark, got a lot of stray stuff in your tail.
I'm trying to work out what bow that is. Obviously it's got some gadgets on it. It could be a modified Hoyt buffalo, sprayed black. He's using a finger and thumb draw, which isn't really necessarily gonna work for that kind of thing. Hawkeye, that's a bit of a mess, dude. He's got a shooting glove, which is good to see. He's got a couple of arm guards on there as well. That's what's called a biter arm guard. That's just a make of arm guard. Thin strip of plastic, and it just protects you from the sort of the string as it sort of vibrates back to where it's supposed to go. Sometimes it can just catch your arm and just give you a little sting. So you tend to have a little bit of an arm guard who just protects you. Traditional archers tend to wear like a bit more of a leather kind of bracer. You wouldn't wear two unless you're doing something really wrong.
Well, they can't bank with a damn.
If you can't look at it, how are you going to shoot it? The trend with these kind of dynamic things is that there's never any kind of anchor point. It's always just pull it back and let it go from whatever position you're in, which is fine, but you're not going to get that kind of level of accuracy that he gets. Like he's shooting moving targets. Now there is a famous trick shot, but you're looking in a mirror, and I've tried it, and I'm almost succeeded. He's got what, maybe 36 arrows maximum when he first starts. It's like films with guns. You get people shooting and they never seem to have to reload, but it looks like it's fun, so I'm gonna have to give it 4.
Too slow! Fast as you can! Again! Come on!
People can knock arrows out of the air. It's not something I would recommend trying, because if you get it wrong, you only get one chance. I want people to enjoy archery, but I also want people to be really safe when it comes to archery. There's a huge safety element to it. Although a bow isn't classed as a weapon, it's classed as sporting goods. It can be used as a weapon. He's shooting arrows at the guy and he's knocking them out of the air. I'd hate for some kids to think, hey, let's try that and do it and get hurt. It would break my heart.
Try the other side. It will save you a second on the reload.
He gets to show him a different way of shooting. Now, this all came from Lars Anderson video that came out a few years back, and it kind of turned the archery world on his head. And it suggested that you took the arrow from the left side of the bow to the right side of the bow, which goes from essentially a Western style of archery to an Eastern style of archery. Changing anything in archery is a slow process. It takes time for your body to get used to such a change. And going from one side of the bow to the other, it would take time.
Yes. Come on! Again! Fast! Yes!
If you shoot the arrow on the right side of the bow with a Mediterranean release, one finger above the arrow, 2 fingers below, what happens is the arrow veers wildly off to the right, which isn't ideal. And there are people that can shoot a Mediterranean style release like the way they get Robin Hood to do in this film. You've got to pull the bow out this way. If you're doing big dynamic movements to try and get the arrow to go straight, they're very difficult to repeat, so you're not going to be fantastically accurate with them. It's just something that I personally, I'm not a huge fan of. There are people that shoot hybrid style, sort of east and west. At the end of the day, you've got to shoot in a way that's comfortable and that puts the biggest smile on your face. Because it does require a certain amount of fitness, a certain amount of stamina to shoot, because it's, you know, they're not easy to pull back, and you've got to hold sometimes tremendous weights for, you know, a good few seconds before you make the shot. You know, various lifting weights isn't necessarily going to work the archery muscles.
Faster! Stronger! Faster!
That is actually a good archery muscle he's working there. That's going to do more for him than bench pressing wheels. You can use stretchy bands, things like that. That sort of builds up muscles and whatnot. See, I want to give it a really low score, but I like the working out with the ropes, so I'm going to push it up. I'm going to give it a 4. She's using sound to make a deer move into a more accessible shot, which is fine, but I would imagine a deer would have just bolted at that stage. You know, from my experience, they're pretty skittish things.
What are you going to do with that when you kill it?
I like it personally when you're at full draw, you come to anchor and you're there. You know, if you're doing all this, the shot's gone. You need to have focus. She actually has beautiful form in this film. And she was coached by an Olympic archer called Katuna Lorick, an American Olympic archer. Again, a fantastic archer. So her form is an Olympic form, which is fantastic for target archery. Now, she's in a hunting scenario. That type of archery isn't necessarily going to work fantastically well in this sort of scenario. There's so many variables. You're uphill, you're downhill. You're waiting at full draw for something to come into shot. She's doing a bit of wing shooting there. She's shooting a bird. Shooting a moving target is also difficult. And you wouldn't be able to use an Olympic style of shooting to shoot a moving target. Now, they look like huge plastic feathers. And she's shooting off the shelf. That's not necessarily going to work out too well. The sort of bow she's got there is not a million miles away from this type of bow. That's called a shelf, so the arrow sits on there. And as the arrow passes over, the reason why traditional archers use feathers is because they compress and they don't really cause too much of an issue. Where if you're shooting plastic feathers like those, that they're not going to compress like a feather would, and that's going to cause some fouling on the shelf. Shooting a broadhead, which is a hunting arrow, so a two-bladed broadhead, and it's stuck into the target quite realistically. That's kind of how a broadhead would stick into a hard target. Even a light poundage bow would probably do that. It's not hardwired into the pig's mouth or anything, it was just resting there, so I don't think it would take a huge amount. I mean, I've tried to shoot apples before, and what tends to happen is the arrow just goes straight through the apple. So you knock it off whatever you're shooting, but I've yet to pin one to a wall. The type of archery I do, it's called instinctive archery. I don't use a sight, and I let my mind and my brain and my muscle memory work subconsciously to let me know where to shoot. That's what she's doing there, I would imagine. Although she's got a very Olympic style, where she's looking at something and she's just bang, and she nailed it. I've always got a soft spot for the Hunger Games. Do you know what? I'm going to give it 7. A whole battery of archers is going to really mess some orcs up, which is what's happening there. I can't see the types of arrow points they're using, but I see in a lot of films people using broadheads and shooting at armor, and that wouldn't work. There were certain arrow points that were designed to go straight through armor, like a bodkin. It's pointy, but it's bulbous and it's stiffer, and it was designed to kind of punch through armor. His elbow's a bit high, but, you know, I'll give him that. When you got some big orc dude with a stick coming at you, you're not always going to get a chance to set and make the perfect shot. But in order to speed shoot to that kind of level, you'd need a pretty light poundage bow. I'm going to go 4, but it's cool. This is more of an Eastern style. His arrow is really short. And he's got like a piece of bamboo on the arrow attached to the bow, where the short arrow will, because obviously the longer the arrow, the heavier. The shorter the arrow, the lighter. The lighter something is, the further it's going to go, the faster it's going to go. So it means you can pull the bow back all the way and put maximum juice into that little arrow. He's using his thumb. Typically, you overdraw with that style of archery. You relax that hand and come away from the thumb and let the string. You can see the focus in his face. Breathing is a weird one. Some people hold their breath, some people breathe through the shot. If you're hunting and you're waiting for a deer to sort of come into view, you could be holding for a good 10, 15, 20 seconds. Olympic archers tend to hold for a lot longer. Some people are even quicker. Some people come to full draw and then make the shot. I guess if you can't drop him straight away, you can you can wound him and then chase him down and poke him with something else. Obviously, if there was a barb on it, you couldn't pull it out. You'd kind of have to pull it through, which would be agony. That to me looked like a sharpened stick. So yeah, you could probably pull that out. medieval archers used to do when they put their arrow points on, they would put them on with wax. If they hit you, you pull it out, the point's still in you. Or if you missed, it landed on the floor, the point would come off, so it couldn't then be shot back at you. But weirdly, archers nowadays are more likely to be injured by the knock end than the pointy end. Because when that's in the target, people walk up and stumble and things, and that can be quite sharp. I'm going to give that one 9.
Hi there, my name's Dave Rawlings of the London Longsword Academy. I'm a full-time swordsmanship instructor, and today I'm going to have a look at a load of clips about sword fighting and slag them off hideously. So basically what I have with me here is a longsword. Longsword for me is generally a sword which is held in 2 hands. So it doesn't matter whether the grip is short or long, it doesn't really matter. You have a pommel, a crossguard, a grip, a blade. Usually within fencing we divide that into 2 halves, but different authors divide it into different divisions. So we'll have a strong half, which is the half from the middle to the hilt, and then from the middle down to the point is the weakest part. And we're just really looking at geometry and leverage. That you get this big thing in historical European martial arts, as I do, where you're not allowed to carry swords on your shoulder because that's really, really frowned upon and no one would ever do it. Except there's actually critique in manuals saying that you shouldn't do it, which implies that people do it. So carrying the sword in your hand is a very, very good thing, and you see this a lot, people holding the sword on their shoulder and just walking around with it without a scabbard on necessarily, so it's ready to use. I have issues with this particular fight because there's a lot of reverse grip with the sword being held backwards down here. It's not a good way for you to use the sword. You sacrifice your ability to defend above very, very clearly. You have not got any reach. It's not safe. But he's changed grip. Yay. Oh, and he's back. I like how he moves. I think he's got a good organic feel to him. Generally, the sword is being moved in front of him, which is a very, very good thing. It's very rarely just kept behind him, so he's closing the space off between him and his opponent with the sword. One of the things I like about some of the Witcher's fight scenes is that there's this idea of moving between the opponents. And you see this in things like Godino, where the idea of spinning, something which people really, really quite often frown upon within the HEMA community, is very much used because you're trying to keep opponents away from each other. So it's not just about fighting you and concentrating and moving into you, it's against driving you back and then hitting the next person, the next person, the next person. So these spinning moves actually become quite important, and this angled, sinister, straight into you idea goes out the window. It's not this focus. Suddenly it's much more wide and it's a flurry. The thing is most of my judgment on this fight scene is actually Henry Cavill being very, very good physically, and what is shown in this fight scene being probably the most disappointing fight scene in The Witcher. So for Henry Cavill it's going to have like an 8. For actual quality of fighting it's going to have about 4. So there's bits in there that actually aren't too bad looking at it. There's evasions of the blade from the Emperor, which could be accidental, but you have these movements of just moving around as the parry's coming in. That's actually not too bad. You see this kind of thing quite often. You see it in Destreza when opponents are moving around each other, where a parry comes in, you disengage underneath as it's happening. So you have potential for some actually quite interesting movements in there. Good parry. You see that in Talhofer, usually accompanied by a wrap because of the close distance. Kicking up the heels is referred to in quite a few treaties, quite often accompanied by a movement onto the jaw as well. So potentially within this fight scene, I'd say in those last 2 actions, from the cover to the kick with the legs, the sweeping up of the heels, I'd say those are actually quite good actions. Usually you'd see more control of the opponent's weapon arm or their balance with the offhand as well, but that part's actually reasonably good. So for that, I'm actually going to give it a 6 because I think those 2 aspects save it slightly. Okay, so again, we've got some very, very good bits on this. The first bit of this is the shunting away of the opponent. I really, really like this. He creates distance between the 2 opponents. Now, you could argue that maybe he'd want to push the opponents into each other, but he has a very, very good instinctive response. Push one away, get the weapon from it, and then onto the other one. And then a good, clean finish on one of the cuts. Nothing posh, just a simple cut of wrath in effect. Pretty good. I'd give that a 7. I think that's quite a comfortable thing. Again, I think it's very easy within judging this from a behemoth perspective to get very focused on an individual, and this is showing good awareness of space, maintaining that distance, and then simple finishes, nothing posh. So immediately the first attack is this big, I'll spin at you, I'll expose my back, and the distance is so bad that he could just be stabbed in the back. Yeah, it's a broadsword or a sabre or something, therefore you have to go and cut candles or scenery. You don't use this like this. This is terrible. Quite often in Japanese swordsmanship, you're moving the glass deposits, the slag deposits, effectively silicon deposits, that can be in steel. You're moving those throughout the entirety of the length of the blade, and through those foldings you spread that out, so you make sure that your blade hasn't got one particular area of weakness. Now with European swords, before we had that consistency, we did something very similar, except that we twisted them like string. So that if one thread was weak, then it could be a problem in itself, but you having multiple threads and twisting them around each other, you create something stronger. That said, swords do snap, swords do bend, and there's always a fine point, and you can't guarantee. The process is not perfect. Even nowadays, with much more clear definitions of how steel should be made and produced, blades still break. So it's not impossible for this to happen. So this is where it really gets quite terrible. There's this insane idea that somehow longswords are really heavy, clumsy weapons. They are not. You can move a longsword much more quickly and much more dexterously than you can a rapier. It's still balanced as if to be used in one hand, but you have the advantage of being able to move it around this position, the position of the forward hand. Now, even the most barbaric moment of a longsword, barbaric technique, we have a technique called the strike of wrath, which is a strike that uses the entirety of the anterior oblique sling. So it's the most powerful strike you can do. But it's not done foolishly. It's done as a mechanic. It's a way of claiming space in front of you, claiming that space for yourself, killing with it if you can, and then going on to pursue your opponent through that. Wide swings don't serve anybody, and they represent the actual piece of equipment very, very poorly. Doing a spin when you're not engaged with the opponent's blade is insane, because you don't know what their sword is doing. And because you're so close and you don't know where their sword is, obviously they can cut you freely because they're still facing at you, they still have all of their requisite safety in their hands. 3-4 out of 10. This, in case you didn't know, is the best fight scene ever in any film ever. The fencing in it is completely irrelevant. The fencing is part of a narrative device. It's not meant to overwhelm you. It's just there happening while the dialogue does.
You're using Bonetti's defense against me, huh? I thought it fitting, considering the rocky terrain.
There's references to Bonetti's defense. I don't even really know what that is. But references to Thibaut, and Thibaut's one of my favorite systems. But they're not showing any awareness of Thibaut. Thibaut operates on the idea of the perfect angle that you see in a lot of Spanish swordsmanship, and destreza particularly, here where you have a 90-degree angle which is maintained as much as possible, and you don't make lateral movements with your arms, but all of this is what we call vulgar angles, where the point is higher than the hilt and lots of lateral movement.
Naturally, you must expect me to attack with Capaferro. Naturally, but I find that Tybalt cancels out Capaferro.
Rapier, some people call it a side sword. The divisions are really a later thing. We don't worry about it too much. It's a sword that you hold in one hand. Now, again, we have the quillons. Quite often, which is like the crossguard in effect, quite often people would hold this simply like so, without their finger over the bars, and these extra rings would be to stop things from landing on your fingers when you're holding the sword normally, and this allows you to put your thumb on there. Later on, you start seeing people holding the sword like so, okay? But it's not universal. Sometimes it is just used like this. Okay. Sometimes these are very, very ornate, as you can see here. There's a lot of wire around here, and then sometimes it's just a simple cup.
There's something I ought to tell you. Tell me. I'm not left-handed either.
The idea of being able to fence with both hands shouldn't be necessarily a problem. Fighting somebody who is differently handed to you as well shouldn't be an uncommon experience. So this kind of thing, although it's amusing, you don't want to do this sort of thing at close distance, because obviously while you're busy changing your sword hand, your opponent can stab you and this kind of thing. Here you have a bit where as the blade comes through it disengages, so you're having the blade changing from one side to the other, and in order to fight that, what you're doing is rather than doing lateral parries like this, you're wrapping the blade and you're staying engaged to it, and that can be used to throw the opponent's sword out their hand. So there's a degree of reality in that. It's good. Technically wise, I'd still give it sort of like a 6-7. Even with its parody fencing, it still has better fencing than a lot of the others. That's quite nice because in effect you have a very, very nasty version of a movement of conclusion. And this is basically where in using a sword to parry here, we then do something with the offhand. If we were doing verdadera, the idea would be to restrain the opponent's weapon hand so we can control it and we can choose whether they live or die, and we can show mercy at this point. If you're doing this, this is lovely. He doesn't have to worry about the guy's offhand so much because the guy has both hands on the sword. There's a closure off of the line, and the guy giving him the distance, because he doesn't have to move his feet, the guy's going to come and hit him anyway. He gets to push it aside, he gets to thrust through, he's got control of the opponent's sword still, and he gets to finish him. So that I actually quite like, that's pretty good. I'm not entirely sure holding your hand palm down with a longsword is a good way not to get the sword taken out. Oh my goodness, this is terrible. There is so much bad in this. Again, we're back on this idea that if you've got a longsword, you have to do this with it, and it has to be wide and spinny, and it has to be these big moves. It's meant to be dexterous. You have this idea that there's basically half an L, the idea of being this kind of space here, rather halfway between here and here. You don't want to be more than this way, far away from your opponent with the point at all times. So if they drive you away, you're trying to find a way to get your point onto them. Most longsword is intrinsically trying to dominate a space very, very close into the core of your opponent. If they move you sufficiently around, you're immediately back at another opening. If they stay tight on the blade and the angle's tight, just enough to parry like so, you'll try and drive the blade in, still maintaining contact on that. All this wide around movement is complete nonsense. Okay, knocking the blade down and striking back up. Now, you could argue that this is almost a nodding in effect. The idea of beating someone's blade down and then hitting back up with the false edge. Here you see where the sword is sweeping wide and one person is standing with their point right in front of the other. You don't parry, then come back here. You stand here and you stab them immediately because the blade has moved out of presence. Well, that was good. Yep. If someone has got their back to you and you have a spear, do stab them in the back of the leg. That, again, redeeming feature, that's given another point. So I quite like the fight scene between Brienne of Tarth and Arya. I think that's quite good. It's cohesive. It has that real focus to it. So the movement is constant. Neither of them is really sacrificing. There's no great pauses. There's always, I want to be back in the fight. I want to be back in it. I do like, in general, the hound fights because they are just like, dead. That's good. And I think having that idea that a blade is intrinsically there to either stab someone or hit them with it and remove all the sort of like fussy detail is a very good thing to have in a series. First, the twirling is dreadful, but the blades are all over the place. There's no safety in them. And now we're being focused on a single opponent, we could use the sword in a much more efficient way. Even if I were to twirl the swords towards you, you'd always want one blade in presence, always one blade doing something, never having the swords over here. At that point, I think the idea of restraining the two weapon hands becomes more important than actually taking the weapons out of the hand. So at that point, I would suggest that potentially you're looking at a way of either throwing the opponent as far from you as possible, throwing them down the really big hole on the other side of you might be a good thing.
So what times for that one?
2. Yep, she's dead now. Yeah, you're really looking at just absolute theatre here, and that's fine. It is what it is, but it's terrible, terrible sword fighting. This idea of driving people apart to fight. So you don't want to be standing still. You don't want people to be managing the space while your space is getting more and more cramped. One of the things that is misunderstood quite often is that in pattern welded blades, quite often these were given mirror polishes. And I believe, unless this is anecdotal, that there's reference to people blowing on the blades so that the breath actually brings out the pattern weld for a moment so you can see it. So yeah, blades historically are incredibly highly polished in various different places. Certainly in Japanese swords that's the thing, certainly in European swords it's a thing. Interesting tactical decisions here. So you have a point where somebody has control of a blade, and if you think like the parrying daggers, you have really options to take the blade of the opponent on your dagger or to take them on your sword and to attack them with the other. But in order to do so, you'd want to maintain that contact. So to do an action like this with the opponent's blade still directly in the middle doesn't make any sense really. So you had a point of control or a point of control, both of those have been sacrificed. It's amazing that one of these people didn't die in the process of this. There should have either been disemboweling or a stab or whichever, or the other person should have ploughed straight through the middle in the space. From the viewpoint of a good cohesive fight scene that involves realistic technique, I'm going to give that a 2. Okay, the first miracle of this fight is that they don't manage to kill each other. There are forms which consist about fighting around somebody. Usually that other person is disabled so that they're kind of in a position where you don't have to worry about them. They'll be prone or something like this, or perhaps you'll be bodyguarding someone, so it's a way of moving around each other. I would not really like to have my back to someone who is swinging something sharp or burny. So much of this is almost a method to show how he feels. So you have an expression of emotion going on in the fight scenes rather than necessarily being this very, very tight, cohesive fight. His anger is always explicit. Everything is these wide, powerful slashes that aren't necessarily good for defense. It's so heavily stylized. I think in things like the Revenge of the Sith, you have these very, very dynamic fight scenes between Obi-Wan and Anakin, and those, I think, are much more expressive at combat, even if the distance is a little bit funny, even if they're standing toe-to-toe and waving the swords around. There's a lot more aggression and interaction in that. As such, I think I'd give it a 5 out of 10, as in, it has aspects that I really enjoy. If I was going for my enjoyment of the fight scene, it would be an 8. I really, really love the Yoda fight scenes. I always have. Again, it's that point where you separate any desire for reality. It doesn't have to be real. You know, if it's got dragons, if it's got the Force, it doesn't matter. It has to be something expressive of all the things you want in there. Yes, absolutely. If you can cut flesh, you can cut fabric. Again, it depends on different things like how sharp the sword is, but they are made to cut things. The horses were very realistic. Let's give it a 1.
Hi, I'm Tobias Capwell. I'm curator of arms and armor at the Wallace Collection in central London. Since I was a kid, I've been riding horses and fighting in armor. I've taken part in competitions, armored combat all over the world. Today we're going to be looking at the treatment of medieval arms and armor in cinema. Oh, stop. Did you see that? He just got shot in the armor, and it knocked him, but it didn't stop him. And you know, in a complete armor, a medieval knight can suffer horrendous physical punishment that would kill an unarmored person like that. But you can take the hits, and in armored combat, there are times when you decide to let your opponent hit you because you know you can take it and you're going to do something else. You're not going to waste time defending what doesn't need to be defended. And the armor in this clip takes on, again, narrative significance. It's storytelling. He can take a shot right in the chest. So that's a pretty big character point, wouldn't you think? He's not clunking around all cumbersome. He moves like a real knight. I've been jousting and fighting in armor for 30 years. You know, I built a lot of different kinds of armor, working with different craftsmen all over the world. Real armor of the late Middle Ages and the Renaissance is like a steel skin. It's not bulky. It's your shape. The armor should fit you like a skin. It should follow your musculature. It doesn't have to be a lot of space under there. It's fitted. It moves with you. The plates are hardened and tempered medium carbon steel, so they don't have to be thick and chunky. They need to glide over each other and move like you move.
Tell me where the Mandalorians are, and I'll walk out of here without killing you.
He hardly ever takes his helmet off, and yet you know everything about his expression, his feelings, his character. Historically, a knight has a very close personal relationship with his armorer. The armorer is responsible for his safety, but he's also the guy who's going to mold your character. That's never really been explored, until this.
I said, where are they?
It's got a couple of possible sources of inspiration. On the one hand, it looks a lot like an ancient Greek hoplite's helmet, the ancient Greek heavy infantry of like 500 BC or thereabouts. These very distinct spectacled helmets with these like eye cutouts, the nasal for the nose, and then the cheeks brought in. In the Bronze Age, they're trying again to get as much protection for the face and the head as they possibly can. So that's where that really closely set kind of spectacled profile comes from. That was then imitated in the Renaissance. You know, in the 15th century in Italy, and very rapidly everywhere else, people became fascinated with the classical world again. And they started looking back to the ancient Greek and Roman precedent. And this style of helmet became fashionable again in Italy and Venice, in the Venetian Empire specifically. In the 15th century, most used by infantry, shooting crossbows and firearms and more lightly armored troops. And in the ancient Greek period, they were the heavy infantry, but they still had shields to hide behind, and they're actively protecting their faces as well as relying on their armor. I'd give this a 10, absolutely. Vikings is a fantasy. You should really treat it as a fantasy. There's a lot of things to like about this show. And that makes it almost the more tragic for me, because those Anglo-Saxons are all wearing late 16th century helmets. The Burgonets with the high comb and the peak, they are 800 years wrong. The leather biker gear. There is almost no historical evidence for leather clothing. Almost across the board, people in the past did not make clothes out of leather. It's a distinctly modern thing. The axe is fine. I don't have a problem with the axe. I do have a problem with none of the main characters wearing helmets. You can't go anywhere near a battle like this without a helmet. So I mean, someone like Ragnar Lothbrok, or someone of that stature, would have amazing mail coat, he'd have jewelry, he'd have big, thick gold stuff on him, he'd have a gilded sword. He does not have to look like a pile of leather crap. I'm gonna give it a 3.
Could not be undone.
That is metal. Nothing else looks like metal but metal in close-up. All that decoration is etched into the steel with acid. This is film armor as good as it gets. Now, there are lots of great spraying techniques, and you can spray plastic to look reflective, and increasingly it looks more and more like metal, but it doesn't behave like metal. Their armor's a little, you can see it's a little bit too flexy. There's something about metal that it has a weight, it has a rigidity that rubber and plastic and polyurethane don't have. He walks into the battle, and you know everything you need to know about this guy, and it's all coming out through his gear. They've taken real 15th century armor styles, mostly German, and then turned it up to 11. Sauron is wielding a mace, and maces are real. It's a hafted weapon with a wooden or a steel haft with a flanged or bladed head on one end. So all the weight of the weapon is balanced to the end. And it's a concussion weapon. And you're trying, rather than to cut or pierce your opponent, you're trying to smash through their defenses. That is way bigger in proportion to him than any real maces were. Real German Gothic high medieval maces of the 15th century are, they're usually pretty short. They're like just a little bit, more than a foot or a bit more long. The heads are quite small, but they got these really sharp blades on them, and you're focusing your energy on a really small area. A weapon doesn't need to be massive to have the effect that it needs to have. But massive always reads well on screen, especially when you've got a Dark Lord of Mordor. And how successfully does it use armor and weapons to bring its characters and its themes across? I gotta give this 10 as well. Poor old Arpats looks like a pile of garbage, I'm afraid. This is a mishmash. There are a couple of elements, the shoulders and the body armor, that are vaguely 15th century, but they're about a generation too late for Agincourt. His helmet is just ridiculous. I mean, that has a vaguely 16th century profile to it, but it fits badly, it's too big, it's clunky. Oh, come on, man, what is this? Well, this is obviously supposed to be the Battle of Agincourt in 1415. At the real Battle of Agincourt, it was very muddy. The French had 10,000 fully armed knights. That was the entirety of their army. They had archers, but they didn't use them. The Pas de Calais mud is like this thick, gluey clay stuff, very difficult to move through. And it would be difficult regardless of what you're wearing. Armor often gets blamed for the French defeat at Agincourt, as if the French were wearing heavy armor that the English were too clever to wear or something. The fact is, the English, including Henry V here, were wearing full plate armor of the time. The English had 1,500 fully armed knights, whose job it was to protect those famous archers. They go about it sort of the right way, in that this knight is someone who's been trained to fight and kill people since he was a child, and he's very, very good at it. The only way you've got any chance of this, if you're an archer or an English foot soldier or whatever, is to get 6 or 7 or 8 of your friends and pile in, all at the same time. Don't take turns, he will kill all of you. You gotta all go together. And 4 or 5 of you gotta hold him down, and then 1 or 2 of you have to stab him in the eyes and in the gaps in the armor. You don't stab through the armor. When King Richard III was killed at the Battle of Bosworth, they immobilized him, they held him down, someone took his helmet off, they probably cut the chin strap and took the helmet off, and then they can do as they like. They cut off the back of his skull, they stabbed him right through the brain, they did whatever they wanted. I'll give it a 1 because they've got mud and archers working together, but I can't give it any more than a 1. It's a massive lost opportunity. It's a legal procedure where they're determining the ownership of territory with a trial by combat. They're attacking each other on the wrong side. If you can see, they're passing right to right, which is wrong. They shouldn't be doing that, because your rein hand is in your left hand, so it can't wield a weapon. Your rein hand is in your left, so your left side is more exposed. So that's where your shield goes. Your lance is in your right hand. Nobody's allowed to be left-handed in the Middle Ages. In traditional knightly mounted combat like this, you always pass from left side to left side. Unhorsing someone is very difficult, and it only happens when certain key factors all come together. The timing's got to be right, the impact, the placement of the lance on the body's got to be right, where he is in his stride of the horse when he gets hit. There's lots of things that kind of contribute to the likelihood of being unhorsed. But as a general rule, it's very, very difficult to separate a good horseman from his horse. If this was a later period, in like the 15th century, full plate, when you have full plate armor, you can be run over by a horse in full plate armor and you'll be just fine. I've seen it happen. This is kind of a weird choice in this film because El Cid, Rodrigo de Vivar, is a real person, but he lived in the 11th century, in the late 1000s. It's largely looking like the early to mid 14th century. Uh-oh. The 16th century two-handed swords are coming out now. We assume for some reason that a bigger sword hits harder than a little sword. That, you know, these are not firearms. This is not a higher caliber sword. You know? They didn't have two-handed swords in El Cid's lifetime. What you're seeing Charlton wearing here is what's traditionally referred to as string mail. It's a knitted garment, knitted with big knitting needles. So you've got big loops in the weave of the knitting. And then they iron it flat, spray it silver, and it looks like mail, or they think it does. It doesn't really look that much like mail, but it's been the mail substitute for years and years and years. And it's fine, you know, for the background. And I'd still pass it for the background, but you can't have it in the foreground. 5 out of 10. A diving suit is very much like armor in the sense that it protects you from a hostile environment of a different kind. It's a complete fantasy because he's not got an air supply. Diving suits are a real historical thing. There are designs going back to the 14th and 15th centuries, in the late Middle Ages, of designs for diving suits. The skills of the armorer would be recruited for doing something like this. They work purely on a basic system of water displacement. The suit is not watertight. The water can get in. You pump air into the helmet and it displaces the water below your face. But the water, as the pump is going up and down, the water goes up like this. And it sometimes covers your face and sometimes goes down, and you hope they pump hard enough to keep you from drowning. It's dicey, but it's possible. I give it a 7. It's very, very interesting. Hey, what's he doing? Stop that. No, can't do that. That's not how you take a sword apart. I'm sorry. This whole idea of melting a sword blade down and then recasting it in a mold, which is what they're doing, you can't do that. If you reduce the iron or the steel to its liquid state, you lose all of the properties that you want. If you melt and cast iron in a mold, it's cast iron, and it becomes really brittle, and you can't temper it, and you can't heat treat it. You know, when you have a lump of iron ore as it comes out of the ground, yes, they heat the iron ore to separate the iron from all of the silicates and the rest of the stuff that it's mixed up with. You never fully melt it. You don't bring it up to the full melting point. You heat it up until the chemical reaction occurs in the ore, which separates the iron from all of the other junk. And it sort of gloops down into the bottom of the bloomery. Weaponsmiths are very, very careful never to fully melt anything. You cannot melt armor down and make new armor. I don't care if it looks good on screen. It's dumb. I like some of the things that Game of Thrones does with armor, but that's a fail. That's a 0. I love the sort of evil Statue of Liberty sort of, you know, aesthetic here. I think the star of that scene is the flail. Real flails are derived from farm implements, the articulated staffs that are used for threshing wheat. And if you have a feudal peasant army and they need to take whatever hurty things are to hand, a flail, you know, agricultural implements are good. It's a staff with just an eye bolt articulation and then another piece of wood. When such an idea is weaponized more extensively, they add a short length of chain between the staff and the head. Flails almost exclusively are a lower class common soldier infantry weapon. The knights didn't use them. Because they're kind of scary, and they have an inherent mechanical intrigue, they've become much more famous and much more popular to the kind of popular conception of the medieval knight than they really deserve to be. But it's great here. I mean, again, Totally works here. No flail was ever that big. No flail ever had a chain that long. But in this context, it works great. I can't think of another weapon that would have the kind of visual and story character-driven impact that this has in this scene. It's got to be a 10 out of 10. Now, he'd be dead. He'd be very dead. One man can't attack a shield wall like that. Nobody ever used rectangular shields. I mean, that's ridiculous. It's stupid. And real early medieval shields, which were all circular, as far as we can tell, if air can get through, then a lot of other things can get through. Most real shields of this period are made out of boards, placed edge to edge, sort of like this. But they're placed properly edge to edge, and they're glued, and they're sealed, and there's arguments, good arguments to be made for them then being edged with rawhide, or sometimes covered with hide or textile and glue. And you should not be able to see that much air through your shield. He's been stabbed right through the chest between those plates. They're showing you how their own made-up silly armor doesn't work. Now maybe if he gets hit full in the chest with a spear that's wielded by someone who knows how to use it, his padded textile and mail armor, which is what he should be wearing, or even maybe a scale armor, maybe it wouldn't stand up either. No, I can't, I'm sorry, I can't find anything to hold on to. That's a 0. Well, bad lance technique. I'll give them a pass on that because they wouldn't have known what good lance technique is. It's a very common thing in jousting sequences in movies that they lower their lance to a horizontal and then they kick on and gallop along, and they're galloping along with their lance on the level. You don't do that. You're sitting on a horse. You've got 12 feet of pine lance, and the horse is going up and down like this, and you've got it here. It's inevitable that it's going to start to do this. And it's got a steel head on the end. There's weight right out on the end of that. And pretty soon, this thing is going up and down, and you couldn't hit a barn door with the thing. You've got no chance of controlling where that spear goes. And you get the horse going, and then you don't have to worry about your opponent until the last second or so of the interaction. And then it comes down, boom. It takes practice. If you're too late, you miss. If you're too early, you get tangled up and look like an idiot. But if you get it right, you're always on. A lance came down, it got tangled up with my lance in a joust, and it came down, and the steel spearhead, which has 3 prongs like this, 2 of the prongs went past my hand, and the third one bypassed the defenses of my armor, the gauntlet. It went just under the plate, through the leather glove, and into me. I finished the competition before I even realized I needed to go get sewn up.
Yield, sir. I have the advantage.
Now again, this is all metal armor. It's all aluminum. Aluminum sprayed black or aluminum polished. But look how good it looks. They worked hard to do what they were doing, and they knew what they were doing, and I think it deserves a 7. Traditional ranged weapons like the longbow and the crossbow, the projectile isn't moving that fast, but it's still moving way fast enough. You can't block arrows.
Remove the hood and the mask.
It's an interesting outfit he's got on. Who's he come as? He's got a vaguely 11th or early 12th century helmet, but he's got full plate armor under there like the 16th century or something. I'll give it a 2 because it's funny and it's Nicolas Cage.
What business does an elf, a man, and a dwarf have in the Riddermark? Speak quickly.
Yeah, this is a great entrance of a character. Tolkien imagined the Rohirrim as Anglo-Saxons who fought like knights on horseback. Because the Anglo-Saxons didn't. They rode horses, but they got off to fight They didn't fight on their horses. The design of the helmet is derived from early medieval examples. He really should have his chin strap done up. The helmet is riding a bit too high on his head. The brow of the helmet, the horizontal edge there, should be right down on his eyebrows to really protect the front of the skull. You want to bring that down as far as it can go, and it can go right down onto your eyebrows. So I'll stick this on, all right? This is one of my own, made for me. Okay? Now you see, that brow is right down on my eyes, and it's sticking out beyond my skull, right? So a weapon comes in, it can't get to me. The skull, it might get there, but that's still safe.
Give me your name, horsemaster.
You know, things were often more highly decorated, even for practical fighting, than modern people often imagine. They're going for armor that looks kind of architectural, like the dwarves build, you know, caves, and they work with, you know, rock, and it's under mountains and stuff. So they're looking for a kind of blocky aesthetic. It's starting to look a bit too much like polyurethane here to me. There's something about metal that it has a weight, it has a rigidity that rubber and plastic and polyurethane don't have. I got to dock them a couple of points here for the fit and the chin strap, but it's still got to be like an 8 out of 10. What's he doing? I think his son was already a knight at this point. I don't know why he feels the need to knight him again. This is a total mishmash of pretty good and pretty not so good. The mail that you're seeing in close-up here is real mail, and you can actually even see the rivets that are closing each of the links. It's not fitting him well, and it's not tailored to him. It's something that's been just hoiked out of a van and stuck on the actor. A lot of film mail is just like plastic links butted together, sprayed silver. For a lot of uses, it's fine, but they don't have the rivets. Real mail is, you know, iron links riveted closed. I appreciate the fact that he's got a lining under there. He's got padded textile under the mail, which you have to have, otherwise it is going to do precisely nothing for you. A lot of exposed throats there. And they've stuck random articulated shoulder plates over the mail shirt. This is Robert the Bruce in the early 14th century. They were starting to introduce more hard armor. They're a long way from full plate armor at this period. They're a significant way away, really, from articulated constructions like that look a bit like the tail of a lobster or whatever. It's a later thing. And the shoulders were less of a priority in this period. If you're going to put plates on a guy in this period, it should be on the elbows and the knees. And here you can see his mail is a little off center. His bagging around his throat just is bad. The key thing about a mail hood is that it has a piece called a ventail, which comes up and ties up to the chin, and it's sculpted to protect the whole throat. You know, this is armor that's doing nothing because I can stab him straight through his windpipe. This film is actively engaging with real heraldry. Heraldry is the system of colors and shapes put onto shields as a form of visual identification. So when all these guys are in armor, it's hard to tell who's who. Heraldry was the answer, and it works very well. They got things wrong that they didn't have to get wrong, but they still did a fair amount that's right. 7 out of 10.
What? Nothing.
I like this little scene because it shows that getting shot with arrows isn't immediately fatal. And Gilles de Rais here, Joan's companion, who was incidentally a serial killer in real life. He was a pretty despicable child murderer. But anyway, he knows that he can take a hit. She's not wearing armor in this scene. He is. Shot for shot, a longbow arrow has very little chance of hurting a man inside. You need the kind of mass volume that Henry V organized in his armies to put so many arrows downrange that somebody's gonna get hurt no matter what.
I asked for a grandiose coronation, and this is what you get. This?
He wouldn't do that, almost certainly. He'd wear his coronation robes. And all of his knights certainly wouldn't wear armor to a coronation. Certainly not rusty, banged up stuff like that. Most of this is aluminum. This armor is made by Terry English, who's one of the most famous modern armorers working in cinema. He's made armor for lots of things. He made Arnold Schwarzenegger's Mr. Freeze armor for the Batman movie. He's made Space Marines armor for the Aliens, and he's done a fair amount of historical stuff. The king here is putting on gold armor. It's gold colored. And this is actually good. This doesn't look like gold armor, but fully gilded armor, where you have steel armor, and then it's copper plated, and then it's fire gilded, where you mix gold with mercury, and you apply this mercury gold mixture. If you then heat that mercury up and you boil it off, it leaves the gold chemically bonded to the steel. Normally, most people wouldn't be able to afford that. I mean, really only kings can afford this. And not all kings, but the French kings liked this. It was a distinctive thing, actually. It creates an image of a king as like the sun manifested in human form, like a superhuman being. But it would have been nicer if they'd given Terry the budget to gild it properly. I give it a 4 out of 10.
We've already been through this before. We both know you haven't got it in you.
A sword is not a gun. Pointing a sword at someone out of range with your arms fully extended so you have nowhere to go with it doesn't achieve anything except making you look like you've never held a sword in your life. You point your weapon out there like that, he's going to take it away from you. There's often not enough color in medieval depictions in cinema. Medieval people loved color, bright color and richness. It didn't populate their world very much otherwise. Okay, so you've got your leader, your king, leading a cavalry charge. They're in wedge formation with the king at the point of the wedge, which is great. This is how it's done. The guy on the point of the wedge is steering the whole cavalry charge. He's like the guidance system on a missile. The wedge formation is one of the most effective formations for a heavy cavalry charge. This guy's chin strap done up, love that. He's still got his visor up, which is good, because at this stage, he's still far enough away from the enemy where he's got other things to worry about. A cavalry charge might start when you're maybe 600 meters away from the enemy line, but you're not going to be full pelt straight off. You need to start the charge in good order. He's got to look around and make sure his formation is maintaining its position. They're keeping their cohesion. If he starts running too fast, then they have to catch up, and then they start getting too spread out. They've got to stay close. He's got to be watching that. Fine. But now the real test of this sequence, and the thing that Hollywood hates to do, is cover its famous actors' faces. But in a real cavalry charge, this guy, once he's got himself set up, he needs to close that visor. And let's see if they do it. He could close it right about now. Now would be good. Ah, he's closed it. I give it a 7. If I could change one thing, I would change this. He's wearing his gorget on the outside of his breastplate. The gorget is that neck plate. He should actually have plates covering his throat. The gorget has neck plates in here, and it comes down and has this larger chest plate. That chest plate should be underneath the breastplate. And the breastplate has a turned edge to stop things sliding up into your face. But if anything does get past, it hits the gorget. But in Game of Thrones, they habitually put them on the outside. And it's a howler that I can't abide. And fire arrows were a thing, especially in naval warfare, when you've got key pieces of equipment you want to set on fire, like sails and rigging and things. Fire arrows, as a rule, get way overused in cinema. These are a little more interesting, though. There's something more interesting going on. You see, it's not just a lump of burning material stuck on an arrow. They've actually got some kind of explosive charge on these arrows that has a fuse. And this is actually much more historically plausible. There are early incendiary manuals from the 15th and 16th centuries that give designs for different kinds of gunpowder bombs and other explosive devices to be put on arrows and crossbow bolts.
My lord!
I love this right here. That's armor doing its job. You know, an arrow, when it hits you in full armor, it'll probably glance off. That's what armor's designed to do. But if it hits you square and it gets enough purchase, it can start to bite into the steel. And if it hits you somewhere on the arm or the shoulder where the steel is thinner, it might even get through. Chances are most arrows are not going to get through enough to do meaningful damage to the person inside. But they are going to get stuck. And seeing a knight fighting on the walls in a siege with arrows stuck in him is the best thing I've seen all day. 10 out of 10, absolutely, just for that.
Hi, my name is Thekla Hutyrova. I'm a stuntwoman and martial arts world champion, and I've been doing nunchucks and martial arts in general for about 18 years. Today we'll be looking at nunchuck scenes in movies. It's very traditional nunchuck style. It's a lot of the passing under the hand stuff, which is super cool and like more old school. The longer chain ones might be more practical. The longer the chain, the further your reach is. This is about the length I think that they were in that last clip, because the ones I compete with, it's a shorter chain, so you can do more like flourishy things with it. Not only did he hold it normal grip, which is your thumb facing the chain pretty much, but whenever he switched his hands, he had them backwards a few times. You don't see that often. It's a style, I think it's like knife, you know, you have like your regular standard grip and then you have like ice pick where it's upside down. So I guess that'd be like the ice pick version, which is cool. This is the normal grip, but it's neat to see it this way because obviously it works the same way, but it's just cool. You don't have to start under the armpit. I think that's another just traditional move. They usually like spin it, catch it under the armpit, and then shoot it back out again. And I think maybe that's more of a sneaky way to do it as opposed to like being loaded here, right? You're here and then everyone's like, oh, there's no way. And then like traditional weapons especially come from like farm tools. This was just for like smacking grain out of hay and like wheat and stuff. And then someone's like, this works on grain. I wonder what it'll do to someone's face. I can't rate Bruce Lee, 10. All right, maybe 9 because he showed off for way too long. You can kind of see a little bit in some of it where maybe the actress isn't completely that well versed with the nunchucks. They're a little bit slower. She's kind of using more of her body and like more of her arms and stuff instead of just like moving the nunchuck very skillfully, but obviously she's quite skilled. There's a few cool moves though. The neck, sliding under the legs and hitting him. It's pretty cool, but it's definitely not as realistic to think that she wouldn't just be grabbed or something. She's being a lot more like calculating and like choreographed with it. The last move where she like puts it on her foot and kicks it, I've seen actually like done in forms. So I'd say like 7, but I still love it. Oh, double! There we go. He's just doing the same combo over and over. I love it. It's funny how often it's just like the demonstration of the weapon, especially with nunchucks, is like the bit that is so highlighted. He did a good job. Like obviously it was him doing it, and like the move where he like crosses them isn't very easy to do. If I were to be in a fight with nunchucks, I think I would just try to make the big swinging strikes. The best one's probably from top to bottom at the angles. You can do side to side or like a nice uppercut. Anything else ends up being a lot more specific. Also, I mean, groin, knees, those are always like defaults for self-defense moves, and a nunchuck to the kneecap wouldn't be very comfortable, so that'd probably be a good one too. So like what he did, you know, just like wailing on him is probably like a really, you know, good default. I want to say they're foam ones in that scene too, just by the weight that it looked like they had when it bounced back. Real nunchucks are made out of wood. They're illegal in California. It's just always such an interesting question that like people ask that kind of confuses me sometimes about like, are they real? If you're training with a sword, if it's made out of metal, it is, but if it's not sharp, then I guess it's not real. Like these are real, they're just foam. So it's like a weird, you know, like what the definition of a real weapon is. He just did the demonstration, which was really cool, but the actual fight bit was like 3 moves and the nunchuck bounced back. So like a 5. Yes, concealed carry nunchucks. So cool. I've been known to just keep them in a backpack or a purse because I forgot that they're there. So they are very like concealable. Whew. That's dope. I love that he used it to take on a bunch of people surrounding him because I feel like that's probably the best use of it. Just because if you spin around fast enough, like people aren't going to want to attack you. I think that is a really good use of a flaily weapon. Like if he had a stick, someone might grab it, like disarm him, or you know, like it's an easier thing to catch when it's like one stick, but when it's a nunchuck, like it's terrifying. It's scary for the person wielding it, much less someone in front. Those swords are made really well because they're like layered bits of bamboo together. I think it would have to be a really like perfect storm for that to actually happen, seeing as how like these aren't very sharp. But it's Donnie Yen, so you know, like it's possible. If they wanted to swarm him, they could have like beaten him, but I think it's a really good way to capture the like efficiency and the use of the actual weapon. So I don't know, 9?
A fellow chucker, eh?
Yeah, I mean, rolling it over your hand is always harder because it involves letting go of one of them and just letting it roll over your hand and get to the other one. It's hard to do with the longer chain because you have to be able to get that. So I'd say like straight strikes are the easiest, and then something with a spin, and then something with a release as far as difficulty tiers. So like that difficulty scale and the speed, I think, are pretty good signs of like expertise. You gotta love Ninja Turtles. It's like the dueling pianos thing.
Keep practicing.
See, this is where nunchucks get a bad rep. They're like, oh, no one's actually doing anything with them, and then the guy with the stick comes in and beats everyone up. But if they actually got close enough where nunchucks would hit someone, maybe the guy with the bow staff wouldn't have to be there. They showed some good expertise with the nunchucks, but there was zero fight, actual interaction, so I'll have to give it like a 2 or a 3. But again, for the demonstration bit, maybe like a 6 or 7. Alright, ooh, pass around the back, nice. Again, with this, you see a lot of just straight strikes, not so much fancy stuff when you're actually interacting with people, with which, again, like it's the diagonal strikes, the sideways ones, upwards. Hitting the guy out of the air was probably the least practical thing. I still liked Donnie Yen's version better with like everyone attacking at once, because again, this was a little more choreographed where like all the bad guys come in at their designated time, which is plausible, you know, of course, but I think if you're a mob trying to end up hurting someone, you just like go like 1, 2, 3, let's go! Finishes them off with a kick. He used a lot more, you know, like martial arts kicks and other movement as opposed to just swinging the nunchuck around, because obviously someone who can do nunchucks should have some background in martial arts. It made it feel more realistic because of that as well. The strikes were awesome, but then there were a few of the more intricate things, like when he like wrapped the guy's arm, which I feel like took a little longer than it probably practically would. Like if someone's punching, you don't really have all that time for that to happen. It's plausible, of course. Like while it still felt very specifically choreographed, it was a lot more believable than the kick-ass one where there were just like so many specialty moves. Would really suck to get cracked like across the jaw or like the eyes. Obviously a sharp weapon is more practical in a real fight if you're actually wanting to like hurt people that bad, but I do think if you know what you're doing, they end up being like a stick. I used to think that they're not as effective or as good because I thought they'd like bounce back, but again, if you don't hit with anything but the last bit, it just whips by a little bit and then you have a lot of power in that last bit. Maybe not the easiest thing to use in a real fight, but I do think they could probably be pretty devastating if you know how to use them right. Maybe like a 7? That would suck. I feel like the physics of that doesn't quite work, but it's a cool move, you know? I liked the Bruce Lee character dodging. He's very skilled to dodge that close to the nunchucks, but I liked him stepping offline and like punching the guy and taking the nunchucks, which is what you want to do with disarming a weapon of any sort, right? Like you want to kind of get in past it and get past the that end where the most power is. There was one bit where he like hits the pipe and then hits the guy's hand, which is really like a cool take on it, because like hitting fingers would suck, whereas you're not going to disarm the pipe out of someone's hand. Important muscles for using nunchucks, one of the main ones is actually your wrists for the more intricate movements, and then obviously your arm and your back. And power comes from your hips. Range of motion is very important, arguably more important than muscle mass. This one's tough, because I liked this one. It showed like a variety of styles, but like if we have to rate it on practicality, like 7 or something. Nunchucks. These people need to start holding onto their weapons a little better. Yeah, it's funny to keep seeing that theme of just people taking nunchucks from other people in all of these. I've never noticed that until you have them back to back. You're like, what is going on? I don't know if I would block an axe with it, just because I'm not sure how sharp the axe is and how heavy, and like it's kind of a small chain, so it's not unlikely that it might snap it. There's also other blocks, like this ends up actually being a block as well, because you're here, you're blocking all that. And then you can also kind of block if you just hold their stick on your arm, so that's a good block as well. Again, like I don't think they're the most secure things to block with, but that's not a horrible move, especially if you're stepping off to the side, just to like ensure you're gonna not be hit if something does happen. Probably parry instead of just block straight on. I don't think it showed off like the practicality of nunchucks all that well. You'd have to be very skilled and very specific with your movement to be able to pull that off at all, and I wouldn't recommend it. So maybe like a 5, but it was a cool little scene. Ooh, there's that move again. I mean, he obviously knows what he's doing based on our criteria from earlier, like the intricacy, he's switching hands and the speed at which he's moving them and the spins and everything. So that's really cool to see. I grip it like maybe a thumb width away from the chain and the top, because that's where you have the most control over the other stick as well. I guess for like distance and like just the straight strikes, you might grip it a little lower, and then also depending on the intricacy of your movement, sometimes for some moves you want to grip it a little bit lower so that you can get it around your hand for that, or you want to grip it a little higher if you're doing like a finger spin or something. But generally speaking, you want to be close to the chain on top, and then all you have to worry about is where the chain is flinging the rest of it. So it's a lot more controlled. I don't do the like eyes fluttering thing. It is kind of indicative of not knowing the distance and like location of the nunchucks or any weapon really. Like I think people do that with bow staff and sword and stuff as well, even if it's just foam. Like if I throw it and lose track of it, then I do that obviously, but I do know where they're going most of the time. But you definitely hit yourself quite a bit, especially at first when you're still learning and if you're not being smooth. A lot of times it's like funny bone, which is fantastic. Back of the head, which I'm not even sure how that gets there, but that's a good one. Also makes a really good sound. They're definitely special, but I've never like knocked myself out with them or like anything horrible. So practicality wise, I mean like probably like the 4 or 5 again, just because like some of the strikes didn't look like they hit exactly. Oh, this is the quintessential scene. I can't rag on this. Canceled immediately. I like how, I feel like it is realistic how few times they hit each other with them and how much more it is kind of like a distraction. Like that first move he did like Bruce Lee just like a distraction move and then kicks him in the like the ankle to throw him off. So like that stuff's more practical, I think. It felt maybe not like gritty realistic, but it did feel realistic within like if you're sparring with someone, you're gonna show off your moves and everything and like kind of like test the waters and the distance, which they were doing a lot during the like demonstration periods and just kind of showing off very simple straight across strikes, which would work. But yeah, I think that's one of the best ones we've seen for sure. I'd say that's the 10. So the spear kind of beat the nunchucks in that, I think, even though she won. Definitely less intricate movement. It was kind of nice that there wasn't a demonstration of skill in this one. It was just like it went right to the fight. Maybe the nunchucks weren't the right choice for that girl to use in that fight against a spear. It wasn't bad. I think the other ones obviously were much stronger, showing the benefit of nunchucks and like the practicality of it and the impact of them. Because even in this, like, she hit the girl across the face, but like there wasn't a lot of impact on how that would actually feel. And I think the distance, again, looked a little off because they were so close. So a lot of her strikes ended up being a little weaker looking. The distance felt a little off, and the filming didn't quite showcase the nunchucks as well as some of the other clips would have, so maybe like a 4 or a 3.
Hi, I'm Matt Easton of Schola Gladiatore, and I teach people how to use things like spears and swords and daggers, and I also deal in antique weapons. I've been teaching people how to use weapons for 20 years, so today we're going to be looking at some polearm combat scenes from movies. Okay, so stab in the foot there, that was really nice, and I think a lot of people might think that's silly, but funnily enough, there's an anonymous treatise from the early 16th century that repeatedly talks about stabbing the opponent in the foot and stabbing them in the crotch. So absolutely it was done. This kind of distraction tactic is in medieval treatises, so I love it. Okay, whoa. There's like spinning this thing around. So this is a thrusting weapon, but she is twirling it around like a snooker cue in a bar fight. That's not going to have much effect on people. It's not a good striking weapon. Thrust with it, it's a spear. Taking turns. So this is a favourite way for multiple people to attack a hero in a movie or a big villain, is to take turns at attacking them. Just attack them at the same time. Don't go 1, 2, 3, 4. So if they are trying to surround him, they should still have their spear points forward predominantly and form essentially a ring of points around him. Perhaps the only excuse you could give them is they're trying to capture him rather than trying to kill him. One of the things that really bugs me about spear use in Black Panther is that the spears are used more like quarterstaffs. Now, not to say you can't use a spear like a quarterstaff, you can strike with a spear. It's just not the most efficient and effective way of using a spear. If you've got a sharp point, use the sharp point. So I've got to be honest, I'm going to give it a 3 out of 10. So tridents absolutely were used in combat, most famously by Roman gladiators, of course. That's the most famous example, but tridents did continue existing into the medieval period. The fact that you've got multiple projections at the head, the fact that they are heavier, this is a heavier weapon designed for fighting against armour. In that sense, that makes them more like this poleaxe here. He seems to have a secondary crossed guard a little bit lower down, which is quite interesting because there's a parallel with European poleaxes there as well, which has a hand guard here. That's not only to protect the hand, but it's also to give more force to the push. So if you're fighting in armour and you plant the cross, as it's called, in their armpit and you want to push them, it gives you something harder to push against. So one of the first things to note is how twirly this fight is. I'm not a huge fan of such turning. I mean, they turn their backs on each other so much. So there's a really nice technique there where he basically turns the back end of his weapon around his opponent's neck in order to throw him. It's sort of an impression of some of the techniques that we do see in historical treatises. And in armour, this is a very good way of overcoming someone. They can get up, but it's not that easy and it's not very quick. That gives you the opportunity to attack them while they're on the ground and disadvantaged. And you can look for the gaps in the armour like their armpits. There's a really nice technique there where the bad guy, one end of his weapon is locked up, and so he swings the other end of the weapon round to strike with the back end. And again, that's completely typical of poleaxe combat. If one end gets occupied or dealt with, then that being pushed aside, you immediately come round with the other end or the middle. I would give this about a 5. So Troy's really, really interesting because it's one of those rare occasions in movie fights where we see them actually attempting to use spear and shield together. You know, the spear and shield was absolutely the standard dueling weapon for heroes to fight with in the ancient world. And you only have to look at ancient Greek vases to see the two heroes standing in front of each other with the spear raised and the shield in front of them. Achilles lances his spear out at maximum length with a thrust, and that is predominantly how spears are supposed to be used. You grip it as near to the back of the shaft as you possibly can. It's actually remarkably difficult to find an opening to stab with a spear if the opponent has a large shield, as here. That's why people used them. Really, really nice detail there. We see Achilles switching the spear around, so he's using both ends of it. And in fact, we know in the ancient Greek world, spears often have two ends on them. Throughout history, a lot of types of spears have two ends on them. So you can stab with the main principal end, but you can also stab with the foot end or the heel. It's not usually so sharp or so big because it has to stand on the ground a lot of the time, but nevertheless, if you're being stabbed with it, it's fairly unpleasant. So there was one little minor detail there that kind of bugs me. Hector basically kind of slashes with his spear, and now with a typical spearhead like this, it's not going to have a lot of cutting potential. So, you know, I suppose it's fair that in a pinch, you might do this to make someone back off, especially if it's kind of face level. So it's going to make a person flinch or move away. But even if it had connected, it wouldn't have done an awful lot of damage. It would have been like being hit with a stick, basically. Resting the spear on his kind of back and thrusting over the top of his shield. This is incredibly short range and I think of dubious use. Breaking a spear shaft with a shield, would that work? Probably not. Look at movies where things like this spear are chopped through with a sword. We've done experiments, we've tried to do it. You can cut through a spear shaft, but it takes several blows with a sharp sword. It's not a lightsaber. Breaking through one with a shield, even less likely. So really, spear shafts are designed to be relatively durable. Relatively light, but not super light, but pretty strong. If they're not strong, then they're not going to work as effective weapons. We see Achilles' spear get broken by being stamped on. Now, this is slightly more plausible. I don't think it would be as easy as it's shown here. However, it's more plausible than breaking it with a shield. An 8 out of 10. This is a very special javelin, but this is an Olympic-style javelin. It's not really a weapon. If it's the same as a typical one, it's an aluminium tube with a kind of slightly pointy end. So this is not something that's designed to, you know, penetrate thick clothing or go through armor or anything like this. And I have to say, they're not terribly strong either. I mean, if you stepped on one, you could quite easily bend it. He's using it like a giant lightsaber, as if it's magically cutting through people, but I don't understand how or why. Finally, a stab. Oh, a double stab. So finally she thrust with it. I have no issue with that. She actually used a spear like a spear eventually, but you know, what's all the swinging it around? It's not going to cut anything. I'm going to give this a 1 out of 10. It really, really bugs me how he uses this spear. It is the most stupid way that he could have used this spear. Basically, he could have won this fight in the first few seconds if he just used it like a spear. Instead, he uses it like, I don't know, like a broom handle. He thrusts with the wrong foot backward, giving himself the minimum reach. He's got enough space, especially in a corridor, to occupy that space with the point of the spear and keep the opponent in front of him. So the main advantage of any polearm, but particularly of spears, is reach. But with reach also comes leverage. The two things go hand in hand. A small movement at the back end means a large movement at the top end. So quite simply, if you're trying to get around an opponent's shield, you can go from high to low. You could go above the shield and below the shield in the blink of an eye, which takes longer to do with a sword. The usual balance is a spear person can beat 2 swords people if there's no armor and no shields involved. A spear is a game changer. Spears can block with any part of the shaft. You can block with the tail end. Sometimes the middle of the shaft can be used. The problem with using the middle is it means any defense is closer to your body. But most predominantly, spears are used with the pointy end projecting forwards, and most of the defense will be done with the front end. The way he uses this spear is infuriating, and at one point, he's even got the spearhead pointing backwards away from the opponent while holding the blunt end outwards. I mean, he doesn't even have two spiky ends. It's an entirely metal spear, which is unusual. Generally, you wouldn't want to make a spear entirely out of metal because although it would be stronger, it would be so heavy that it would give up the advantages that the spear has. If you make it heavy, it also makes it far easier for the opponent to grab. Although they have a lot of advantages of reach and leverage, they are way, way easier to grab for the opponent to grab hold of than something like a sword. A sword is mostly blade, so it's harder to grab. This particular fight will get a really low score of 2 out of 10. I loved this episode, but this fight just sucked. Too much swinging of the spear, not enough thrusting. Thrusting doesn't look as impressive on screen. It's also slightly more dangerous for the actors as well. Despite the fact that in the modern world we probably think of axes or swords associated with Vikings, in any army in the so-called Dark Ages, in the early medieval period, the spear and shield was the primary weapon of battle. They fought in shield walls with a spear. Yeah, richer people might have a sword and other people might have an axe, but those are weapons that are only really useful once you've closed beyond spear range. One of the great things about spears is they are one of the best hand weapons that you can have in your hand, and they're also a really good missile weapon. At any moment they can get thrown, and psychologically that makes a huge difference within the fight. Even if the opponent doesn't throw the spear, the knowledge that they could throw it at any moment as a javelin really changes how you fight. It makes sure you keep your shield up. It makes you very wary. I've once been in a fight, in a tournament in fact, where the opponent had a spear and shield, I had sword and shield. So I'm up there preparing to protect my head and my torso against the spear throw, and I get a spear right in the leg. And if that had been a real spear and gone through my leg, then I wouldn't have been fighting anymore. Thrown spears are incredibly powerful. They will stick deeply into a shield. If they hit you in the body, you're in big, big trouble. I mean, they'll go through a person's torso, and they'll also penetrate certain types of armor. I would give this 6 out of 10. So what we see here is the famous pike phalanx. These are Macedonians, but pike phalanxes were used all over the ancient world. They were used by the Romans initially as very good against cavalry. It makes it very difficult for cavalry to operate on the battlefield. These are very, very long spears. You're far more limited in how you can use them. You don't generally turn them around and use the back end, although these pikes do have a counterbalance on the back end with a spike on it. Now that's partially so that if the pike gets broken, you can turn it around and use the other end still as a weapon. Also, it provides a counterbalance so you can hold more of the pike out in front. Hoplites were quite characteristic for using the pike two-handed. They needed to use it two-handed because it was so big and relatively heavy, but they also used shields. And so what they did is they strapped the shield in such a way that they can hide behind the shield to some degree, obviously protection against arrows, but also protection against enemy pikes. This has been represented very, very well, very accurately. So against arrows, it's difficult because you know, you're holding a great long pike with two hands and you've kind of got a shield suspended. It's not that easy to, at that point, put your shield up because you're not really holding the shield in the typical way. And also the shield doesn't cover your whole body. The problem with arrows is they'll find, it doesn't matter how good the armor is or what shields you're carrying, they will find gaps. So absolutely, peppering a phalanx with arrows is good advice. So one little detail, it makes it look like the pike is traveling very, very quickly and piercing bodies. And the one thing you have to say about pikes is they don't move quickly because they only move as quickly as the pike block moves. You can stab a bit with the pike, but it doesn't go through an awful lot of motion. 8 out of 10. So it's a massive, massive glaive. A glaive is an English word for a weapon that's essentially like a falchion or broad sword on the end of a stick. So it has the reach of a polearm, but it has the cutting and thrusting abilities and type of a sword. And it would be a form of dao. A dao is a single-edged weapon. So it's something that's very effective at cutting. That's a very, very big glaive head. So this is a heavy polearm. Okay, I actually like the cutting mechanics that he's doing. They're pretty good, but why have they got to grappling distance? He shouldn't have allowed the swordsman to get that close. If you get to grappling distance, the swordsman has the advantage. The spinning around the neck. It's not something you'd really want to do in a real fight at all, unless you wanted to lose. I wouldn't say he's necessarily holding it in the most logical way because he's given up all of his reach advantage by holding it across his body. The opponent's got a sword. He's got a weapon that's twice its length, so he should be using the reach advantage. I mean, it's beautifully choreographed, but a lot of it is totally unrealistic to how you'd actually use those weapons. And that goes for the swords or the polearms. 3 out of 10. So the bad guy has what we'd probably call it a form of halberd. So a halberd is essentially an axe blade with a rear spike, and usually they have a top spike, but if the axe blade is shaped to have a top spike already, then you don't need an additional top spike. Now, the way he's using it, it looks comedic, but actually, can you think, if you're occupying a space, how intimidating that would be? This is a weapon which weighs, probably, if it was a real one and if it was steel, probably about 6 pounds. If someone's got a 6-pound weapon, of which about 5 pounds of that is the end, and they're whirling it around, that's really, really intimidating. One hit from that and you're going down. Absolutely the right thing against a polearm wielder. I really, really liked it as a fight. An 8 out of 10.
Hi, I'm Shane Adams, the owner of the Knights of Valor, full contact jousting company. I've been jousting for well over 25 years. I have 20 international jousting championships under my belt. Today we're going to be looking at horseback fights in movies. They hit, but it was just a glancing blow. There is no penalty for missing your opponent, but you're going to be behind in points. If you hit the target, whether it be a smooth plate or whether it be a targ shield, you get a certain amount of points. And ultimately, if you unhorse your opponent in the full contact style, that's the maximum amount of points. There's probably well over 19, 20, 25 different styles of jousting. Yeah, see that ridge around that shield? Bad news. You don't want a lip around the shield. You don't want any spot where that lance is going to connect and lock into the lip. You want to be able to deflect the lance away from your body. So it's completely wrong shield. The jousting that was there, it was decent for a theatrical style joust. If there were true knights, they wouldn't be holding their shields like that. They're leaving themselves completely exposed from the top of the shield to throat, head. That scene where the horse actually does fall into the joust list, usually it would be the opposite way. So the person would be getting hit coming off to the right side. Based on the fact that we do real full contact jousting, we always drop the reins. So that way there, if you get off balance, you're not going to be pulling your horse to the extent that you're going to be pulling your horse down onto the ground with you. I'm 265 pounds. Add my armor, I'm 415 pounds. Riding a 2,000-pound horse, charging at 20, 25 miles an hour against the same opposing force. It's a car wreck. So when we hit, there is a lot of force being generated. Both guys were not wearing proper equipment as far as gorgets to protect their necks, because the lance can hit and come up and straight into your throat. You could tell right away, looking at the tips of the lances, the hound's lance didn't have a cornel on it, didn't have like a tip on the end, it was a sheer point. Knights back in the olden days, the nobility were the ones jousting. They didn't want to go out there and kill each other. And the ends of the lances had cornels put on them, again, to disperse the impact force on the knight's armor. It's like a cast fist put on. Well, if you don't do that, you have a scene possibly like this. And historically, that could have definitely happened. So I'm a total Game of Thrones geek, and I love the show. However, have to give it a 4. They, utilized just that connection with the horse without the stirrup. The stirrup didn't really come into play until the Battle of Hastings in 1066. A Roman cavalry, it's great riders because they're basically riding just with that feel and connection underneath them. Where the Percherons are now, 17, 18, 19 hands tall, they would have never been that tall. They were a lot shorter back then. As a matter of fact, they were more almost the size of a large pony, to be honest with you, 14 to 15 hands. His horse was tripped up. Down the horse went, and down you go. How does it feel to come off of your horse? Well, flying through the air is pretty easy. It's the sudden stop when you hit the ground that really sucks, just to be honest with you. He rolled, so he was fine. It's a muddy terrain. There's been times when I've, come off my horse that I've landed on my feet next to the horse holding on to the reins. Stay on your horse. But if your horse is going to go down, it's best for you to get clear of your horse, because you don't want that 1,500 to 2,000 pound horse body slamming on top of you. My jousting career, I have very little injuries from my full contact jousting career. The more injuries I've had are training horses for the sport of jousting, and you're getting on a horse in an outfit from Battlestar Galactica, a Cylon, you know what I mean? That's gonna freak a horse out. I'd give the whole scene a definite 8. So you have two different styles of jousting. You have Heath Ledger, with a targ shield, and you have his competitor coming down in full plate harness, more of a northern Italian style, where he had no shield.
Get it in the cradle, get it in the cradle.
Where they were saying, get it in the cradle, get it in the cradle. Before the cradle was the arete. And on the ends of the lances, they'd have a small disc of wood or a ring set in place to be able to catch this arete. So when you bring that lance down, the lance will slide in and lock into that arete. So it'll stop the lance from going any farther back. So all that pressure comes onto your body, and you're able to give that much more of a forceful hit with your body to be able to break those lances and ultimately unhorse your opponents. Try and hold on to 1,800 pounds of force. I hate to admit this, but I broke my hand 7 times trying to learn how to give devastating hits. And I don't know how many times that a bone has been sticking through my thumb in an actual jousting competition. And even in this movie, you see these horses completely decked out, but it's deceiving. A lot of people think, well, they're wearing that armor to protect the horse. Well, the horse was never a target. As a matter of fact, back in that period of time, if you struck your opponent's horse, you'd be stripped of land and title. Why'd they have armor? Well, it was more of a car show. They didn't want to bring their Volkswagen. They brought their Ferrari. Hey, check me out. And that's what that horse armor was for.
Remove your helmet. I'm afraid the final blow of the lance has bent it onto my head.
Where it's smashed in his helmet, and he can't get it off. Still happened back then, and still happens today's modern time as well. One of my dear friends took a shot in the helmet and spun his entire helmet around, breaking his nose. So it looked like literally it spun his head like a top. Of course, we're having problems getting it off because his whole face was all smushed up in there. Even if the target's down here, often you do get hit in the head. Of course, Heath Ledger's helmet, no person in their right mind would have worn that helmet. You do not want the lance to get in towards your face. This helmet, you'll see a lot of different designs. This is called a sparrow's beak helm. It's there because when you receive a direct lance hit, you don't want a flat surface like Heath Ledger received in that hit where it caved his helmet in. It's very, very difficult to cave this style of helmet in, and that's why I use it for my jousting career. Full contact is probably one of the stupidest thing a man could ever do. I'd give it a 7.5. The goblins open up the door and they charge down. That's a true maneuver. That can easily happen, and them knocking down because they caught them at surprise. And you take 10 guys and put them behind each other and take speed of horse, that 2,000 pounds or 1,500 pounds for a lighter horse, charging into that. It's a bowling ball knocking down bowling ball pins. So the question is, can you keep up that inertia and keep on going? So the initial knockdown will knock the wind out of you. It might not kill you, but it's the other 50, 100, 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 horses trampling over top of you, just like cutting grass on a Sunday afternoon. You're going to mow down what's in front of you. So very true and could easily happen, and it did happen, historically, absolutely. You see King Theoden, kind of wobbling off balance a little bit. It could be the fact that the actor wasn't comfortable in the saddle. Picking up a weapon and wielding it on horseback, again, is that much more attention to the weapon and less attention on what you're actually riding. When I train people how to joust, I always tell them from the hips down rides the horse, from the hips up does the task. So the upper body can stay, glued and have a good platform to be able to wield that sword or couch that lance or, spear that ring or whatever your job entails on that given specific day. All the goblins this time prepped and prepared with the long pole arms, locked down and locked in place. A truly historical defense against the heavy horse charge. To the extent that they actually stopped. A lot of the knights would stop doing that heavy horse charge because that horse was worth so much to them. If they actually had to fight, sometimes they dismount and run in and fight on foot and not take their horse. You can train a horse all your life to do this one specific job, and all of a sudden it's go time, and the horse realizes it's really stupid and he'd rather you just go and fight yourself, and he was going to go back and hang out with the sumpter. They had a lot of good historical elements in there and a lot of good action that could have been seen on a battlefield, so I actually give it a 7. So in this situation, a loud bang would just make the horse run faster. It's not going to know where that's coming from. It would shy more of the motorcycles coming up beside it than it would anything else. It would not want to be near the motorcycles, but again, in that scenario where you have cars on left and right, the only way it really can go is forward. So that horse is steering himself at that point. If you have a super fast thoroughbred, you're talking down a street like this, easily 35 miles an hour. Great scene. It looks like Keanu Reeves did all of his own stunt there. You have to be a great rider to be able to do that, and he pulled it off. You could tell he had a stunt saddle on. It had a really high pommel that he was able to grab when he put his foot in the stirrup to go to the side of the horse to be able to, shoot from the front barrel of the chest. In real life, you wouldn't have a pommel that high, in front of you to be able to grab. You would find that for stunt riders. Not to say that a good equestrian can't just on a Western saddle be able to do that. It was a really good stunt, very realistic, and could easily happen. I'd probably give it an 8. This whole scene is absolutely fantastic. Back then they didn't have a green screen or CGI. They knocked it out of the park. That is 100% what I believe historically a chariot race would have been like. A lot of people died in the chariot races. It was a very dangerous thing. I drive a chariot. The more horses you add, the more power and more dangerous it gets. The chariots back in that time were pulled by 1, 2, 3, 4 horses. Of course, you see all these, cars doing drifting on tracks. Well, that's nothing because we can do drifting with a horse and a chariot. It's amazing. Those horses are connected by reins from the lead horses all the way back to the driver sitting in the chariot. In the rider's hands, in this point, he would have a set for the left horses and a set for the right horses, being able to control that. Some riders would have every horse reins coming into his hands. And there is so much power and force that those drivers, to get those chariots to stop, because there really was no brakes, would often have to put their feet up on the front of the chariot to be able to pull back with all their might to be able to get those horses to slow down in front of them. And no CGI, no green screen. That is definitely a 10 for a chariot race in my book. If you have a good riding ability and a good horse, you can do anything on top of that horse. How the rider steps off and a flying Y, or it switches around for a W because he comes back up around the other way and sits back up on that horse. Once you form that partnership with the horse, again, you can do anything with that horse. Cool. I wish I was that good. A lot of trick riding there. The bow that they have is a mounted archery bow. They use thumb release, which is again another tactic for mounted archery. So historically, a Mongolian archer is not somebody you want to meet in the back alley. Absolutely not. So yes, it is difficult, but you have to realize that they've been riding since birth. I think it's a great scene, but I'm not going to say it can't be done. Absolutely it can. I'd give it a 9.
Let them go!
The style that they're doing is open field, meaning that there's no actual list. They stopped having open field jousts because the horses were colliding into one another, and they didn't, again, want those injuries happening to the horses. These were definitely war horses. To have 2 horses charging at one another is something a normal horse just does not do. They are flee and flight animals. They are not turn and charge down animals unless it's a mare chasing off a stallion or another stallion fighting for turf with another stallion. The lances, they could have done a better job. The lances, you could tell, have a tip on them. So they were a tournament lance. It's a cost-saving factor, and they put new tips on. An actual joust of war, which would have been a solid shaft and would have had the pointed cornels, like not the blunted cornel, or the flared cornel. They would have had like points on them. I'm not sure who was teaching them how to joust, but punching with your lance like that, not good. You want to hold that lance as tight as you can to your body, because that's what's going to give that strength. You're not going to get anything by throwing a punch except for a broken wrist or a broken hand. So when he ducked down, the lance also tipped down and unfortunately killed that horse. This is the chest piece for a horse. The patral is what it's called. Now again, it would, there to protect the front of the horse's chest. It still gives enough room for the horse to move its legs underneath, but behind this plate, ultimately is the horse's heart, and that's where the heart is, and one of the vulnerable spots in warfare to strike a horse. And that's why they protected it immensely with these plates. This is a greave, and the thigh piece is a cuisse. Back in that time, the French had the best armorers. So it kind of carried through in today's modern day translation as well. This piece right here, this is, would go on my left side of my bottom leg, but you notice there's nothing on the inside. Well, there's nothing on the inside of my calf because that's how I control and feel my horse. And the reason this is open is so my calf, the inside of my leg, can feel the barrel of my horse and be able to give cues, whether it be left, right, forward, or back. Man, if they could have not punched with the lances and had a solid wooden lance, it would have been a definite 10, but I'm going to have to give it a 9.
私は川上仁と申します。幼少よりですね、甲賀の忍びの術を学んで、もう今現在は日本でですね、この実技を残している者は私一人になってしまったということでございます。映画やテレビのですね、忍者の姿を見て、そのリアルさ、そういったものを評価していきたいと。
Jutsu employs explosive powders as weapons or distractions.
忍者が火薬は非常にたくさん使いますね。一つは敵地を爆破させるもの、あるいはですね、そういう火薬によって照明、明るさですね、そういったものを使う。だからああいうそんな激しいね刀を打ち合わせっていうようなことはほとんどないですね。忍びの者はですね、その任務っていうのは一番大事なのは敵の様子を探って味方に伝えることなんですよね。いやー、随分この映画の剣術はあんだけ刀当てたらですね、刀ボロボロになって切れなくなりますね。
Ninja understands that invisibility is a matter of patience and agility. Abhi.
人間が消えることはないので、まあ忍者がね、そういう姿を隠したり錯覚させるというのは、それは一つの実技の中でのコアな部分というほどでもないですがね、一つの大切な一部分であることは間違いないですね。忍びの術、忍術ですねというのはどういったものかといいますとですね、端的に言いますと現代のスパイとか特殊部隊のそういった実技であるわけですね。難しいね。50%。5。いうようなことを行う、そういう奇襲っていうのが忍者の得意とするところで、待ち伏せもそういった中に入っているということですね。これはかまりというようなとかですね、不死とかね、伏兵ですね、そういった役割なんですね。忍者の主な仕事は夜討ち、それから矢込め、それから朝掛けという、こういう夜に忍び込んで敵を撃ったりか乱したりですね、朝早朝また寝てる頃に入っていくと。弓矢は忍びの術でもですね、一つは音がしないという特典があるわけですよね。そういった意味でも弓矢っていうのは使用されてきたであろうということは間違いないですね。忍者は手裏剣はそんなに使わなかったと思いますね。これは手裏剣ですね。十字剣という手裏剣ですね。こういうものもありますね。これも一緒ですね。こういう手裏剣とかこういったものはですね、敵に当てることすら難しい。ましてこれ刺さるっていうのはなお難しい。まして刺さってもなかなか相手は死なない。忍者が敵を倒すのであれば毒を使いますね。その方が確実性が高い。忍者の衣装は黒という決まっているわけじゃないわけですね。その場面場面、その時によってですね、いろんな色柄のものを使うということですね。黒の衣装ではなかったら藍色、ジーンズの色、あるいは泥の色、そういった色ですね。これは普通の刀ですね。これは胴太抜きという刀が作る刀工というんですか、ものが作った刀ですね。でこれは普通のお侍が使うような長い刀ですね。忍者はですね、暗闇とかで動く、あるいは狭いところで動くので短い目の刀の方が都合が良かったということですね。これはわざと錆びたものにしてるんですね。敵傷をつける時にかなをしたり、なるべく敵に害を与えられるようにこのまま放置しているものですね。このシーンも5ですね。 映画で使ってる鎖鎌の使い方は間違いではないですね。これ鎖鎌ですね。小さいタイプです。これ大きいのとかいろいろ種類があります。今回持ってきているのは小さいタイプ。でもこれも忍者が使う専用というわけではないですね。侍の武器ですね。特に江戸時代は女性が稽古した武器ですね。これをで敵を攻撃したり、これで敵を受けたり挟んだり切ったりですね。こういろいろさまざまに使うものですね。ジャンプをする必要もないけども、ジャンプして使うこともあるにはありますね。技としてはありますね。あんまりしないけどね、時々します。目を隠してですね、トレーニングするというのはあります。ありますね。私は夜間の練習っていうのは頻繁に行いましたね、若い頃はですね。これは夜間の活動っていうのが忍びの者も忍者は多いんですよね。そのためには暗闇で動く練習をしとかないといけないのと、気配を察する練習ですね。全身の感覚を鋭敏にするための練習です。今のトレーニングですね、似たようなものがありますね。指とか拳を鍛えるために逆立ちしたりして行うのはありますから。釘ってそういったものじゃなくて、もう普通の地面あるいは普通の板の間ですね。そういう下に何か敷くっていうことはそういうのはないですね。6ぐらいかな。10点満点の6ぐらいですね。刀で戦うより槍の方が有利ですね。槍はね、非常に敵と戦うのには有利な武器ですね。これは鎌槍という槍ですね。でこれは鎌になっているので敵を引っ掛けたりですね、首切ったり高いところに引っ掛けて登ったり、そういうふうに使うものですね。で長すぎると室内の狭いところでは使いにくい。だからこれは短めにできているわけですね。狭い室内でも戦えるようにということですね。忍びの者はチームで働くことが多かったと思いますね。特に夜討ち、矢込め、朝掛けという奇襲をする時にはですね、当然チームで行うわけですね。忍者が2つ刀を使うというそんなものは決まったものはないですよね。だから武術として両手を使うことはあっても、忍者が両手を使った武器が専用物とかそういったことは全然ないですね。忍びの者が年格闘が下手ということはないと思いますね。武術の修行っていうのはそれなりに行っているわけなので、結構うまかったと思いますよ。剣術っていうのは日本で非常に大切な武術なので、一番たくさん稽古したと思いますね。でも忍術そのものはそういった格闘の術とかですね、特殊な武器を持って戦う術だけではないわけですね。そういったものも含まれる生存するための特殊な技術、それが忍びの術であるわけですね。ヌンチャク忍者はヌンチャクを使うということはないです。ヌンチャクは沖縄の武器です。ヌンチャクは結構強くできているので、人一人以来ぶら下がることができます。ヌンチャクで槍をと戦うんですか？いや、できるでしょう。でも槍の方が絶対に強い、有利であるということですね。3ぐらいですね。ほとんど空手やね。これが手工手かぎですね。鍵になってる。これはもう草を取ったり土をこう動かすそういう道具なんですよ、本来は。でこれで木に登ったり敵を戦ったりそういうようなことは基本的に行わないものですね。これで木を登るっていうのはかえって登りにくいです。だからこういう道具を使わずに素手で登る、あるいは縄を使って登る、そういう方法の方が簡単ですね。忍者が屋根から屋根へ移ったり木から木へ移るという技法はありますね。 窓っていうのは壊すっていうからガラス窓っていうのは昔ないですからね日本にそういうのはありませんからそういうことはやらなかったと思いますね。そうですね、忍びの者は隠れるということはね身を表すずにその任務を行うわけですから当然隠れるということが大切なんですよね。で逃げる時にも隠れないといけないからだから身を隠す方法っていうのは結構大切な技法であったのは事実ですね。これはねちょっと面白かったからね6ですね。忍びの者の働きがその敵地を撹乱するということにあるので火で焼いたりですね、鉄砲で撃ったり爆薬を仕掛けたりでそういうことが役割として重要だったということですね。で火術という火の術ですねそういったものは忍者の得意とするところですね。忍者の使うその火術のことを忍術と言って表現している忍術の虎の巻秘伝書があるぐらいですからね。
Where are you?
いやそれはないでしょう忍びの者の働きはね目立ってはいけないっていうことが最重要なんですよね。ミッション終わったら速やかにすぐに逃げる。忍びの者がすぐにですね、忍びの者というのは忍者のことですが殺人者アサシンとかそういった姿で描かれることが非常に多いんですがですね実態はそういう殺人者ということじゃなくてですね敵を撹乱したりあるいは敵の様子を探ったりするそういう役割を担ったものですね。だから敵と戦うというよりは生きて帰ってその任務を遂行するというそれが実態の忍者ですね。この映画も豪華なというところです。忍びの者が暗殺をやったというのはほとんどなかったんではないかというふうに気がしますね。忍者の走り方もいろいろありますが手はあんまり振らないっていうことになっているのでそういった面においてはね手を後ろにやって走るっていう形はまんざら間違いでもなさそう。映画でやってる九地五神は間違ってますね。もう全てむちゃくちゃですね、形をなんか結んでいるだけですね。九地の印っていうのは自分の身をですね守ってもらう敵からですねで敵を打ち破るという、そういう、密教ですよね。それから修験道とかそういう日本の宗教の中の行の一つですね。
この雷
九地五神は魔術マジックですよね。だから呪術です日本語で言うとねそういったものですね。人間を超える能力は出せないから、普通と変わらないと思いますね。ただ少しだけ、ちょっと秀でたところはあるんでしょうけども大きくは普通の人と変わらないということですね。動物を使う人もいたというふうに言われるんですがなかなかうまくは使えないと思いますのでそれが証拠に犬と出会った時にどうするかとかそういう毒で殺してしまえとかそういったようなことがあるぐらいですんでねなかなか難しかったと思います。この映画は1から10だと4ぐらいです。よくやったな。忍びの者は江戸時代にも当然いたしもとも以前からいたということですね。江戸時代に忍びの者の役割っていうのはやっぱり民衆ですよね。そういうのの監視とかですね、侍の不行跡あるいは反乱しないかとかですね。もう忍術もですね、江戸の時代が終わった頃にですね忍者の武器はですねその鎌とかそういうこういう苦内ですねそういったものあるいは手鉤というようなものは農具これは苦内で穴を掘ったりですねこれで穴を掘るわけですね。で壁にこう穴を開けたりで松明ってこの火をこう明かりにしてこう そういう火を持つための道具であったり、あるいはこれを木とか石垣の間に入れてですね、ここにこう足をかけて登るとか、いろいろ様々にする。最学的にはこれをまた握って敵と戦うこともできると。映画は戦う部分を表現してましたよね。1から10で4ぐらい、この映画のところですね。この4の理由っていうのはね、どうもその忍者の本当の役割の部分っていうのがあまり見えない。
My name is Jamie Yankovitz. I'm the creator of Survival Arts Academy. We use the indigenous fighting arts of the Philippines, also known as Kali, Arnis, or Eskrima. Today we're going to look at some of the movies that have popularized Filipino fighting arts. He has to be very careful in the situation. Even though they're in a public setting, this is a close quarters combat fight. This is them getting very, very close to each other and him not having a lot of time to respond to the blade. The Winter Soldier throwing the blade and catching it seems very flashy. It doesn't seem to be quite useful. It's not very realistic, more seemingly for the movie effect. And then there's a moment where the blade is actually coming at the Winter Soldier right there. So in that moment where he's trying to grab the arm underneath, we wouldn't recommend that kind of response. So the reason being is that the hand that's holding the blade is, again, with that ice pick grip, the blade is coming in right here on the face. And we would encourage students to get on this side of the blade, on the outside, or try to bring that arm another way. It really makes you think about your ability to learn these kinds of techniques. And the truth is that it really depends on the student. It depends on, the style of fighting that you're learning. We would have to give Captain America a 5 out of 10. Just because it wasn't too realistic. As exciting and great as it is, Uma Thurman shows exceptional reflexes. Maybe superpower ones. What we would recommend in survival arts training is the way that we step out of the situation. We would step 45 degrees and we try to be on the outside of the body and the outside of that bladed edge. So we're seeing Vivica actually stab and try to kind of like hit in these broken strikes, but never actually fully commits to full fluid strikes, which would make her movements a lot more realistic and believable and effective in trying to kill the main character. The proper way of striking would be to do fluid strikes, whether you're doing it with a long blade, a stick, a short blade. And so you'll be, moving in a more effective means and also not wasting any movement. So basically when you're holding a knife, you're going to be looking at 2 main grips. So we're going to be looking at this very common kind of knife grip, which moves in this kind of motion. And so you'll see here that Vivica is actually using this knife grip, okay? And then you'll see in comparison that Uma Thurman is holding it in this knife grip, which is the ice pick grip, also very effective. So these are 2 of the best knife grips that you want to understand and also be able to respond to. You can hold it in one hand, switch to the other hand, switch back, depending on your agility. So the idea is that you're never stuck with that one movement or that one grip. You're always trying to figure out in response to counter the other person. So our critique of Vivica's movements are that they're a little bit exaggerated and not quite real. So we're seeing a lot of wasted movement here and a lot of openings for her to also be attacked. For this kind of movie, we would have to give a score of 4 out of 10, but it is a lot of fun and we are big fans of Kill Bill. At first, he has no weapon fighting against multiple weapons and somehow manages to get a weapon. So that's great that he was able to actually disarm, and it shows the different kinds of weapons that we actually train in Kali. So, we work with single sticks and double sticks, and in this particular film, they're working with batons. A baton is just another form of stick work. So having a baton and being able to use that with the fluid strikes against multiple ones is actually recommended. We can trace the roots of these systems as early as the 12th century or the 15th century when the Spanish colonized the Philippines. And a lot of systems are even traced to 1898 when the American colonization period. During these times, weapons were confiscated and banned by the colonial forces. So indigenous peoples creatively hid in different ways. So for example, the blade was taken away, we replaced it with a stick. And the stick represents the blade. And so that's why we always train with a stick first. We also did the movements of the fighting arts within dance. Okay, so right here, where Liam Neeson actually takes the stick off of his opponent, where he disarms and uses it, you wouldn't want to step into that weapon or close the distance unless you were absolutely being offensive on the way in. When you're thinking about going against opponents with a weapon or attackers with a weapon, you would never want to turn your back to that person. The right way would be to come into the attacker being offensive, you know, with an attack to the face and an elbow to the face, anything that is coming in to do some damage in order to get close to that weapon and then disarm it. Clearly, Liam has also trained in a lot of martial arts, in Kali and other martial arts, because you can see it in his movements. We would give him a 7 out of 10, but taking away some of the points because of the technical errors that we notice. The knife is coming and Jason is responding. He's parrying here. He is also maintaining control by staying close to the attacker. So in a close quarter situation, every movement, every second counts. And as you can see from Jason Bourne's movement, every touch is offensive. And that's very much in the Kali style. This is that famous scene where he uses a pen. I mean, it's an everyday object that is really quite dangerous and can be utilized just like a knife. A key can be used, a shoe, a magazine rolled up, a newspaper rolled. These can be very powerful weapons. He was trying really hard to kind of get that knife out of that situation. For us in Kali, we would just break the arm, or we'd step around to the outside a little bit more. Right there, we see just a quick movie camera mistake or camera cheating thing here. The opponent actually throws a left hook, but Jason suddenly catches his right arm and tries to disarm that. So for the Bourne Identity, because of its great fight scene, we would probably give this score a 9 out of 10. Only docking a point for a mistake, actually, that we noticed here. You see that the woman fighting is getting cut, Ilsa, and then the man is also getting cut, but yet they still continue to fight even though they're getting kind of slashed in different parts of their arm, their back. Some of the knife attacks that are coming in seem a bit wasted. A trained knife fighter or someone who's trained in the arts would be more aware to attack more of the vital zones. So, you know, cutting the neck or cutting the arteries, going for some of the kill shots rather than just, you know, cutting in random spots that won't stop the attacker from attacking. Our goal would be to move on the outside of the body in order to capture the knife hand or kind of get around the knife hand and go for that back of the neck shot. So the area around the neck or this whole neck area is very vulnerable as a kill zone. That's why we teach, for example, to have your hands up, protect your neck, you know, keep your eyes and your hands moving and keep them available so that if there are attacks in, you know, you're able to kind of move around, you have elbows, you have things to utilize that are your own body as weapons. But the technique that's being demonstrated here, not so much. There's two moments that happen here where Ilsa actually climbs up on her attacker. So there's a moment where she steps on his leg in order to cut him on the other side, and then does it again in a more exaggerated form for her end kill. And then again, climbs all the way up. Here we go, using the leg, lifting herself up. There seems to be a lot of time here, and the person is holding a blade and not using it. There were a few shots where technically that person should have been dead already, because I saw a knife shot to the neck, and then suddenly, you know, they're able to back up, create space, and come in again. We would probably give this a score of 6 out of 10, just because it's exciting to see a woman, you know, fighting so powerfully, but at the same time just doesn't seem so realistic. This scene is great. You know, you can see a lot of technique here. There's a lot of resourcefulness being shown, clearly a lot of Kali training, and we see a lot of similarities here in the film to the training that we teach. You know, he picks up a very small kind of like personal hygiene item. This can be very deadly when used in the correct way, especially with that knife grip that he used. And so Craig actually used a knife grip just like this, like an ice pick, and is, you know, jabbing and stabbing his opponent with that weapon. Very effective. I think that's another thing that distincts Filipino fighting arts from other fighting arts is the footwork and is the stance work. You know, a lot of fighting arts are actually very linear. Maybe something like karate, for example, you're moving, you know, kind of like in this position of linear movement. But in the Filipino fighting style, our movement is always based on the triangle or triangular kind of motion. And so our footwork would reflect that in sidestepping, you know, to the side or stepping 45 degrees, which Craig really demonstrates. For the effectivity of the technique and the movements, Quantum of Solace, we get an 8 out of 10. This is a fantastic scene. First and foremost, it is great because it gives credit to the Filipino culture where this knife came from. So the balisong is another name for the butterfly knife, which originated here in the Philippines. It actually came from a region in Luzon called Batangas. And it is a butterfly knife because of the way that it opens up like a butterfly and has double-edged blades on each side. So it's very, very dangerous. That's probably something that you first learn when you learn balisong is how to open and close. And so it's very, very, you know, exciting and fun. There is moments of where she's using the blade to actually tap or hit on the body. That is quite realistic.
Smaller caliber version of what design?
Eugene Stoner's Ayrton.
Kali is for everyone. It's especially useful in situations of survival because of the way that we are able to respond to a weapons attack even without a weapon. It's particularly useful for women and children or smaller folks to protect against a larger attacker. Our family system is called Pikiti Tertia Kali, and it originates from the Western Visayas of the Philippines. And this blade culture has been protecting the family since 1898 and even traces its roots to more than 2,000 years ago. We would definitely give this a 9 out of 10, just because we love the technique that Chloe is doing, but we would like to see a little more offensive with the knife itself. We have someone coming in with the straight grip, and we have someone coming in with what looks like a karambit, which is coming on the back side of that blade. When you get real close to the weapon then becomes rendered useless, which is the point sometimes, right? Like sometimes you need to step into that weapon hand or get close offensively in order to take control of that weapon, or you need to find a way to distract and knock the senses in other ways in order to get out of that situation. So very intense close quarters situation with blades, but also very, yeah, I would just say very interesting. You know, when it comes to strength and size, it doesn't really matter when it comes to the blade. So, you know, the blade is the equalizer here because the other person fighting may be smaller or, you know, not as strong. It doesn't mean that they're not as effective with the use of a knife. You can always throw elbows and use the elbow as a weapon. So he's grabbing and kneeing and hitting over the head when he could easily just cut that hand that he already has in his hand, in his power. So that was technically a moment where we would say isn't very realistic and is a little more exaggerated for camera. There's like that big open swing and they're extending the fight where they don't need to. So usually in movies you'll see like total destruction and chaos and collateral damage and collateral murder, but in this case, you know, they kind of stop and wait for everyone to pass and they get right back into it. So it's kind of funny. Probably give it about a 7 out of 10 because they did great, you know, with the knife grips, but technically speaking, there were a few errors that we noticed that kept the fight scene a little too long than it had to be. So right away, we're seeing a very familiar Filipino martial arts double stick drill. It's one of the first things or one of the early things that you would learn when you're learning how to utilize a double stick or double sticks as a weapon. So this is a great drill. We often call this upper six or heaven six. The actors are not properly chambering their weapons. So that's something that wouldn't be seen in a real Filipino martial arts training. When you have the sticks, every time you strike, you chamber. So the idea is that you're always bringing the stick back before hitting again. Is a bit of a camera cheating angle that's happening. So the way that we do this particular drill is with a lot of footwork. You'll see us, moving with the double sticks and moving forward and back, exchanging feet and moving around in a circle, most importantly. At first glance, you might think, oh, well, they are moving around in a circle, until you look carefully and realize that the actors are actually not doing the footwork and it's the camera itself that's moving around in a circle. They do the drill and one of the guys hits the other one. If you're doing the drill correctly, you wouldn't get hit because you'd continuously be doing the drill. So that's another thing that we notice, like, oh, that doesn't seem too realistic because they stopped. Why did they stop? We would probably give it a 4 out of 10 for realism. And it's one of the greatest movies, and it definitely demonstrates a ton of Kali work. I mean, Denzel here is using a long blade. He's fighting against multiple opponents. He's using all kinds of slashes, circular movements, lateral strikes. He's thrusting. He even puts the blade down at one point and then brings it back out. So this is really a great demonstration of extensive Kali training. I do know that Denzel did train with Jeff Yamada at the Dan Inosanto Academy in Los Angeles to develop these skills. Jeff Yamada does train at the Inosanto Academy, where we've trained with our Grandmaster. We've had the pleasure of meeting Jeff. We're talking great classic choreographers here. He is countering every single attack that is coming his way. That's the mindset of Kali, that instead of moving around and trying to go after each person, if you stay in one place and wait for the attack to come, but be able to move the feet and the blade in an effective way, then you're able to respond very effectively. This is a great example of not having to do too much, but also doing a lot in that one space that you're confined in. This weapon looks like a machete. A machete here in the Philippines would be called a bolo. It would be considered an everyday blade, something that would normally be used to, cut sugarcane or to, engage in farming or fishing or building your house. So it seems like, just an everyday kind of blade, but the way that, and the length of it. So the length of it is quite long. It's considered a long range weapon. And because of that, it can be very effective with fighting against multiple opponents. And there's even a scene in the beginning of the movie where he's on a highway patrol and someone tries to attack and he kind of just slices the hand off in a swift single motion. That is the kind of movement that we are trained to also develop. We have to give it a 10 out of 10. Excellent technique, great execution. Gotta love Lucy Liu. She comes storming in with power, with confidence, and she's got not one, but 2 weapons. So you're seeing a lot of exciting movement here. She's attacking different levels, high, low, arms, heads, feet. It's just such a great scene and an example of how a double weapon can be used against multiple opponents, especially in the distance that she's maintaining with them. The only thing about this film is the interesting component that every single one of these people are fully padded in a ton of gear. So we would doubt that those batons would do that much damage to these trained men that are all padded up with that kind of gear. And also the fact that everyone here that she's fighting against has a major weapon. They have a gun. and they're not using it. They're just kind of being thrown on the floor. No one's picking it up. She's utilizing both of the weapons. She's extending her arms and she's moving in full circles. You know, that's very effective. That's the kind of stuff that we teach to be able to, you know, maneuver from one opponent to the other, you know, hitting folks at the same time. She has good motion, range of motion with her weapons. She chambers them, brings them back to the body, hits again, you know, multiple attacks here against that last person, you know, a lot of circular movements. The realism of the scenario, we'd actually give this probably a 6 out of 10, just because we think Lucy Liu's doing great work. Just doesn't seem so realistic compared to her opponents.